Section 1. The Lost Pilot: What Was Buried Before the Show Ever Began. There is something almost dreamlike about the very beginning of Family Guy. Not the beginning most people know, not the moment 22 million people watched a rough-edged cartoon air after the Super Bowl in January of 1999, but the real beginning, the hidden one. The one that spent years sitting quietly on the website of an animator most people had never heard of, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood. Before Family Guy was Family Guy, it was something far smaller and stranger. It was a college thesis. A single animated short film made by a 20-year-old student at the Rhode Island School of Design, a school tucked into the coastal city of Providence, where the winters are long and gray and the kind of place where a young person with too many ideas and not enough sleep can disappear into their work for months at a time. Seth MacFarlane arrived at RISD with a knack for drawing and a sense of humor that didn't quite fit anywhere yet. He was studying animation, and like every student in every creative program everywhere, he needed a thesis project. Something to show at the end of his studies. Something to prove that he had learned something, made something, understood something. What he made in 1995 was an 11-minute animated film called The Life of Larry. And if you watch it today, which you can, because it eventually found its way onto the internet, you will feel something very specific happen. A kind of double vision. The slightly disorienting sensation of watching something you know and don't know at the same time. Larry is a middle-aged man. He is overweight. He is not particularly smart. He carries himself with a confidence that is entirely disconnected from his actual abilities. He has a dog named Steve, a dog who is calm and composed and speaks with a dry, measured wit that cuts right through Larry's delusions. Watch those two characters interact and you are watching, in rough sketch form, the earliest version of what would eventually become Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin. The resemblance is not subtle. Larry's shape, his voice, his relationship with the world around him, it's all there, drawn with the shaky lines of a student project, animated on a budget that wouldn't have covered a single day of professional production. But the spirit of the thing, the comedic engine underneath it, is absolutely recognizable. The idea of a foolish, lovable man paired with a thoughtful, slightly exhausted dog who has seen too much that was already fully formed in MacFarlane's imagination before he ever set foot in a professional studio. After MacFarlane graduated, his thesis film was submitted to Hanna-Barbera by one of his RISD professors. That single act changed everything. Hanna-Barbera was one of the great animation studios of American television, responsible for decades of beloved characters, and they hired MacFarlane on the strength of what he had made in his dorm room. He worked there for a while, contributing to shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken and Dexter's Laboratory, learning the rhythms of professional animation production from the inside. And in 1996, he made a sequel to his thesis film, a short called Larry and Steve, which aired on Cartoon Network in 1997 as part of the What a Cartoon anthology series. The executives at Fox saw those shorts, and they wanted more. They offered MacFarlane a deal to develop a full television series based on the characters, but with a catch that would have made most people hesitate. They wanted a 15-minute pilot, and they were willing to spend exactly $50,000 to make it happen. A typical half-hour animated production at the time would cost something closer to $1 million. What Fox was asking MacFarlane to do was essentially make a professional-grade pitch on a student film budget. He said yes immediately. What followed was 6 months of working almost entirely alone, animating at home, doing voices, building scenes shot by shot on a fraction of what it should have taken. The result was a 16-minute pilot film that became the key to unlocking one of the most successful animated shows in the history of American television. MacFarlane would later describe the difference between his RISD thesis and the Fox pilot with characteristic deadpan humor, saying that the main difference was that The Life of Larry was shown primarily in his dorm room, while Family Guy was shown after the Super Bowl. The Fox pitch pilot, the one made for $50,000, is where things get genuinely mysterious. For decades, only the first 7 minutes of it existed in the known world. Those 7 minutes had been included as a special feature on the Family Guy Volume 2 DVD set, and fans who owned that set had seen them. But the rest of the 16-minute film? Gone. Absent. Considered lost media. A ghost in the archive. The full pilot contains scenes, character moments, and lines of dialogue that never made it into the broadcast version of the show. The characters look slightly different. The animation has an even rougher quality than the finished first episode, and perhaps most noticeably, the voices are different. Because Seth Green had not yet been cast as Chris Griffin, MacFarlane voiced the character himself. Chris in the pilot, as one viewer memorably noted after finally watching it, sounds less like an awkward teenage boy and more like a drunk frat guy who wandered in from somewhere else entirely. Meg in the pilot is voiced by Rachel MacFarlane, Seth's younger sister, rather than Lacey Chabert, who would voice the character in the first season before Mila Kunis took over from season 2 onward. And the character of Mr. Weed, Peter's boss at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, is voiced by Butch Hartman, the animator and creator who would later become famous for creating The Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Phantom. MacFarlane voiced the vast majority of everything else, hopping between characters with the kind of energy that only comes from someone who has been working alone for 6 months and has simply gotten used to being everyone in the room. The full 16-minute pilot stayed lost for years. And then, in March of 2025, a user on a Discord server connected to the Lost Media Wiki stumbled across something unexpected. The animator, Robert Paulson, who had apparently worked on the original production, had quietly uploaded the complete film to his personal website back in 2022. It had been sitting there, findable, searchable, publicly accessible for 3 years, and nobody had noticed it. The discovery was announced, the film was shared, and suddenly the Family Guy fan community had access to something they had assumed was gone forever. Watching the full pilot today is a strange and absorbing experience. There are jokes that did not survive into the broadcast version. There are moments where you can feel MacFarlane testing things, trying things, pushing buttons he wasn't sure would work yet. There is an energy to it that is simultaneously rougher and somehow more raw than the polished pilot that aired to those 22 million viewers. It feels like watching a band play in a basement before they ever played a stage. The songs are already there. The talent is already there, but the edges haven't been smoothed yet, and there's something genuinely fascinating about that. One detail fans noticed immediately was that Lois, in the pitch pilot, is depicted as blonde rather than red-haired. It's a small thing and probably would have gone unnoticed in any other context, but fans found themselves debating what it meant for the character, with some pointing out that the blonde coloring made a certain genetic logic since both Chris and Stewie are fair. The change to red hair happened before the show went to air, presumably as a way to give Lois a more distinctive visual identity in a family of lighter-colored characters. The pilot also ends differently from the aired episode. In the broadcast version, the final scene closes with the family gathered together in a familiar way, the sense of equilibrium restored after the episode's events. In the pitch pilot, the ending has a slightly different beat to it. Peter looks directly at the camera while wearing a wig and gives a thumbs up, a moment of fourth-wall-breaking absurdity that the show's later seasons would lean into heavily, but which, in 1997, felt genuinely surprising and fresh. There is also a scene that was cut between the pitch and the broadcast involving Chris leaving the kitchen to, quote, go get wasted, with Peter telling him to look both ways. The joke made it as far as the animation phase, which means it was storyboarded, recorded, and at least partially drawn before someone decided it wasn't right for the episode and pulled it. It survived only in a promo that aired before the show premiered, a 30-second advertisement that a small number of people saw and most of them forgot. The pitch pilot also contains cutaway gags that were originally used in The Life of Larry, the 1995 thesis film. MacFarlane recycled material he had made in college, trusting that the Fox executives almost certainly had not seen a student film made 2 years earlier at an art school in Rhode Island. That practical recycling, that instinct to repurpose and recontextualize jokes from one project for another, would become a defining feature of how MacFarlane built his shows. The same joke, transplanted into a new context, can land completely differently. That instinct was already fully operational in 1997. What the pitch pilot represents, when you sit with it, is the moment before everything got decided. Before Brian was definitely a golden Labrador, before Stewie had the precise shape of his accent locked in, before Meg was a redhead, before Peter's voice had found its final register, all of those things were still in flux, still being negotiated between the drawing and the performance and the feedback from the people in the room. The pitch pilot is Family Guy in its most honest state, not the polished product, not the icon, but the idea being held up to the light and turned over slowly to see what it was made of. And it was found sitting on a website, not in a vault, not in a studio archive, on a website, quietly waiting. If you are watching this late at night, getting comfortable and settling in for a long few hours of Family Guy mysteries? Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Whether you are in your bedroom with the lights off, on a couch at 2 in the morning, or somewhere completely unexpected, I want to know. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely means everything. Section 2. The Vault of Deleted Scenes. What the writers chose to bury. Every episode of Family Guy that you have ever watched is the survivor of a long and fairly brutal process. Scripts get written and rewritten. Jokes get pitched and rejected and revised. Scenes get storyboarded and then cut before the animation is even finished. And sometimes, fully animated scenes, complete with voice performances and finished backgrounds and music, get removed from an episode in the final edit because something wasn't working, because the episode ran long, or because someone in a room somewhere decided the moment wasn't right. What happens to those scenes is one of the quieter mysteries of the show's production history. Some of them end up on DVD special features, preserved for the handful of fans who still own the physical discs. Some of them get uploaded to YouTube by editors or assistant producers who thought the world should see them. And some of them simply disappear into the archive, filed away in the production company's storage where they technically exist but practically don't, because nobody goes looking for them. The deleted material from Family Guy is genuinely illuminating, not just as a curiosity, but as a window into how the creative decisions behind the show actually worked. When you watch a deleted scene, you're watching an argument that was lost. You're seeing the version of the episode that someone fought for and couldn't quite keep. And in those moments, you often learn more about what the show was trying to be than you do from the episodes that aired. One category of deleted material that fans find particularly interesting involves scenes that were cut not because they were bad, but because they were too much. Family Guy has always operated close to the line of what broadcast standards will allow, and there is a substantial body of material that was recorded, scripted, and sometimes animated before someone determined it would generate complaints serious enough to cause problems for the network. These scenes tend to be racier than what made it to air, sometimes shockingly so, and the decision to cut them was less a creative judgment than a practical calculation about consequences. The early seasons, in particular, had a number of scenes that were trimmed or removed at the network's request. Fox's Standards and Practices Department reviewed every episode before it aired, and their notes to the production team were sometimes specific and sometimes more vague. The show's writers learned over time which kinds of jokes were likely to sail through and which would generate a phone call, and that knowledge shaped what they wrote in the first place. But they also sometimes wrote things they knew would probably be cut, partly as a negotiating tactic, propose something extreme, and when you're asked to cut it, offer something slightly less extreme as a compromise, and partly just to see if they could get it through. The culture of the Family Guy writing room, by multiple accounts from people who worked there, was one of competitive joke pitching, where the goal was always to find the most unexpected angle on any given situation. Writers would pitch jokes and scenes knowing that the vast majority of what they suggested would be rejected or significantly altered before making it to the broadcast version. The deleted scenes are, in a sense, the iceberg beneath the waterline, the enormous mass of material that made the visible portion possible. There is also a specific category of deleted content connected to the show's 3-year cancellation. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002 and then brought back in 2005, the writers found themselves in an unusual situation. Some of the material that had been developed for later seasons of the original run had never been produced. Some scenes and episode ideas that existed as scripts or outlines in 2002 simply didn't get made, because the show ended before they could be. When the show came back, some of that material was revisited and either incorporated into new episodes or quietly archived. What would have happened in a season 4 or 5 that never aired? Nobody outside the production company can say for certain. The DVD commentaries for the first several seasons are one of the richest sources of information about what was cut and why. MacFarlane and the writers would occasionally reference scenes that had been removed, jokes that hadn't survived, and entire plot directions that had been abandoned. These references are often frustratingly brief, a passing mention of something that sounds genuinely interesting, followed by the conversation moving on to something else. But they provide confirmation that the gap between what was written and what aired is much larger than most viewers assume. One of the more poignant categories of deleted material involves character moments that were pulled because they were deemed too sincere. Family Guy in its early seasons walked a specific line between genuine emotion and cynical deflation, and the balance was carefully managed. Scenes where characters expressed real vulnerability or affection tended to be shortened or cut if they lingered longer than the show's tonal comfort zone allowed. The result is that some of the warmest moments in the show's early history never made it to broadcast, and what remains sometimes feels like a more hardened version of what was originally conceived. The episode Stewie Kills Lois and its companion episode Lois Kills Stewie, which aired in Season 6, are particularly rich ground for this kind of speculation. These were two of the most ambitious episodes the show ever attempted, a two-part story in which Stewie finally achieves his lifelong goal, and the show commits, at least temporarily, to the consequences of that. The production process for these episodes involved extensive discussion about how far to take the story and what kinds of moments were appropriate for a comedic show that was pushing into genuinely dramatic territory. The finale of that two-parter, which reveals that everything that happened was a simulation running on Stewie's computer, is one of the most discussed creative decisions in the show's history. It was the kind of ending that was almost certainly not the first ending that was written. The question of what other conclusions were considered, whether a version where the events were real was ever seriously on the table, whether there were scripts that committed to actual consequences, remains genuinely unanswered. MacFarlane has spoken about the two-parter in interviews, but the details of what was considered and rejected during development have never been fully described publicly. The deleted scenes from the show's later seasons tell a somewhat different story. By Season 8 and beyond, the writers' room had changed substantially from the team that had produced the first 3 seasons. The culture of the room, the kinds of jokes that got pitched, the sensibility that governed what was considered funny, all of these had shifted. The deleted scenes from this era tend to be either edgier than what aired, which meant they were cut for broadcast standards reasons, or they are moments of character depth that were removed because the later seasons had largely moved away from that kind of storytelling. There is a recurring pattern in the deleted scenes that is worth sitting with. Moments involving Meg Griffin that show her as a fully realized character with her own perspective and her own inner life tend to get cut at a higher rate than similar moments for other characters. Whether this reflects a deliberate creative choice, a decision to keep Meg as a target rather than a protagonist, or simply reflects the difficulty of integrating a sympathetic, grounded character into the increasingly heightened tone of the later seasons is something fans have debated for years without resolution. Brian Griffin is the character with perhaps the most extensive deleted content across the show's run, partly because his function changed so dramatically between seasons. In the early seasons, Brian's deleted scenes often involved moments of genuine intellectual engagement. He would make an observation or take a position on something, and the scene would explore that perspective in some detail before it was trimmed or removed. In the later seasons, the deleted Brian material tends to be either his political opinions expressed at greater length than the episodes allow, or moments of behavior so objectionable that even the later seasons' more tolerant standards couldn't accommodate them. The animation pipeline also creates a specific category of deleted content that is unique to animated shows. Because the process of producing an animated episode takes many months and involves multiple stages: writing, storyboarding, voice recording, animation, post-production scenes can be cut at any stage of that process. A scene that is fully written might be cut before it's storyboarded. A scene that is fully storyboarded might be cut before it's animated. A scene that is fully animated might be cut in the editing room. Each of these cuts leaves a different kind of trace in the production archive. The most expensive deleted scenes are the ones that were fully animated before being cut. These represent a significant investment of time and resources, weeks of work by overseas animation studios, music scoring, final sound mixing, all of which is discarded when the scene doesn't make the final cut. The existence of these scenes raises questions about the economics of animation production that the show's creators rarely discuss publicly. How many fully animated scenes from Family Guy have never been seen by anyone outside the production company? The honest answer is that nobody on the outside knows. What the deleted scenes collectively represent is a version of Family Guy that is larger, stranger, and in some ways more complete than the show that actually exists. Every episode that aired is also, implicitly, all the episodes that didn't air, the versions of those stories that were tried and rejected, the characters who were written more fully and then trimmed, the jokes that went further than the broadcast standards allowed. That invisible archive, that record of what was attempted and not kept, is in many ways the most interesting document in the show's history. Section 3. What's hiding in the backgrounds? The Easter eggs nobody told you about. The backgrounds of Family Guy episodes are doing a lot of quiet work that most people never notice. While the main characters are talking, or fighting, or walking through a scene, the environment around them is full of details that have been placed there deliberately references, jokes, callbacks, and messages that require either a very sharp eye or a paused screen to see clearly. This is not an accident, and it's not simply the result of individual animators having fun with the material, though that happens too. There is a culture of hidden detail in animated shows that goes back to the very beginning of the medium, and Family Guy inherited that tradition and pushed it in its own direction. Some of what you find in the backgrounds is whimsical, the kind of small joke that makes you smile when you catch it. Some of it is more pointed references to real events in the production, coded messages between the writers and the audience, or subtle acknowledgments of things the show couldn't say out loud in dialogue. One of the most frequently discussed examples involves the episode Love Thy Trophy, which aired in Season 2. During a scene where Stewie is playing with his building blocks, if you pause at exactly the right moment and look at what he has assembled, the blocks spell out the word R-E-D rum. This is a reference to The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of the Stephen King novel, where the word Redrum murder spelled backwards is written on walls by a child who is receiving psychic impressions of violence. Stewie spelling it out with his baby blocks is a layered joke. It connects his evil genius characterization to one of cinema's most iconic horror images, and it does so in a way that most people watching the episode would simply never see. The choice of The Shining as a reference is not random. The film involves a child who knows more than the adults around him understand. A child whose inner life is full of darkness that the grown-ups cannot perceive. Stewie in the early seasons operates on exactly that dynamic. His mother is feeding him and hugging him while he is literally plotting her death, and the reference to Danny Torrance, another child whose interior world is invisible to his parents' lands precisely because the parallel is real. Whoever placed that Easter egg knew what they were doing. The crossover episode with The Simpsons in Season 13 contains a background detail that requires you to be paying attention to the walls in one scene. As the characters are walking through a building, there is a message written in small text on a surface behind them. If you can read this, your TV is upside down. The text is written upside down, which means that reading it correctly requires inverting your perspective entirely, and the joke is clearly directed at whoever among the audience was sharp-eyed enough to notice the text and patient enough to actually read it. It's a message aimed at exactly the kind of viewer who slows down and looks at things carefully, the kind of viewer who is probably watching this video right now. The show's relationship with its own production is another rich source of background details. Characters and locations named after writers, producers, and other members of the crew appear throughout the show's run, often in places where most viewers wouldn't look. Neil Goldman, a minor recurring character who is the awkward, romantically frustrated classmate of Meg and Chris at James Woods Regional High School, is named after one of the show's actual writers, Neil Goldman, who was part of the original writing team. This is not a hidden detail. Exactly the name is spoken out loud in dialogue, but the connection between the fictional character and the real person behind the scenes is not widely known outside dedicated fan circles. The fictional town where the Griffin family lives, which is described on the show as being located in Rhode Island, has a name that the show uses regularly. The town is described as being in Rhode Island, a nod to McFarlane's own time at the Rhode Island School of Design, and the state's geography and culture appear as background details throughout the show's run. Rhode Island is genuinely one of the smallest and most distinct states in the country, and using it as the setting gave the show a specificity that was different from the generic Midwestern or suburban settings that most animated family comedies prefer. Within the backgrounds of the Griffin family home, there are recurring details that have been placed and maintained across hundreds of episodes. The arrangement of objects on surfaces, the images on the walls, the books visible on shelves, these are not random. Individual episodes will sometimes plant items in the background that become relevant later in the episode, creating a visual continuity that rewards attentive viewers. A book on a shelf in an early scene might turn out to be the thing that a character references by name 20 minutes later. A photograph on the wall might be a callback to an event from several seasons earlier. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend most of their leisure time, has a number of background details that have been analyzed exhaustively by fans. The decorations behind the bar, the objects on the walls, the items visible in the background of crowd scenes, all of these have been cataloged by enthusiasts who watch episodes frame by frame. Some of the details are purely decorative, genuine background texture without any deeper significance, but others contain clear references to other Fox shows, to real bars in Providence, to events in the production history of the show itself. The episode Blue Harvest, the Star Wars parody that opened Season 6, is one of the richest sources of hidden details in the show's history. Because the episode was built as a loving recreation of A New Hope, with the Griffin characters inserted into the roles of the Star Wars cast, the background artists had essentially unlimited material to work with. The cantina scene alone contains multiple hidden cameos. Roger from American Dad appears in the background, and Bender from Futurama can also be spotted if you know where to look. These are crossover moments that were never announced or called attention to in dialogue, simply placed in the frame for the fraction of the audience that was paying close enough attention. The show's use of newspaper headlines as background details is a technique borrowed from The Simpsons and other animated comedies, but Family Guy uses it with its own specific sensibility. Headlines in the background of scenes are often jokes in themselves, sometimes punning, sometimes absurdist, occasionally containing actual information about the episode's plot that has been disguised as throwaway set dressing. The practice of including readable text in the background of scenes is one that requires a deliberate commitment from the production team because it means thinking carefully about what any given frame will communicate to a viewer who looks beyond the main action. One of the more poignant categories of hidden background detail involves references to canceled or unrealized projects. Family Guy exists within a Fox animation ecosystem that has included many shows over the years, some of which were successful and some of which were not. McFarlane's earliest pitch to Fox, before Family Guy, was for a show called Gumball 2 Gumball, a concept that was rejected. The show's name appears in the background of Family Guy episodes as a joke that is simultaneously self-deprecating and triumphant, the failed idea preserved as a background detail in the successful show that followed. The backgrounds of the family home also encode information about the family's economic status and lifestyle in ways that are subtle enough to miss on a first viewing, but become apparent when you're looking for them. The house on Spooner Street is not a wealthy home. The furniture has been carefully designed to look like the furniture of a working-class household in a mid-sized New England city worn in the right places, functional rather than fashionable, filled with the kind of accumulated objects that families collect over years, rather than the coordinated aesthetic of a home designed by someone with disposable income. The animation studios that have handled Family Guy over the years, Film Roman in Season 1, Rough Draft Studios for Seasons 2 and 3, and various other studios in subsequent seasons, each brought their own approach to how backgrounds were constructed and populated. The shift between studios is visible not just in the character animation but in the texture and depth of the environments. Some studios gave the backgrounds a more detailed, painterly quality. Others went for a cleaner, more graphic look that traded depth for crispness. Fans who pay close attention to the show's visual history can identify which studio handled which episode partly by looking at the backgrounds rather than the characters. The most recent seasons of the show have backgrounds that are constructed using digital tools that simply didn't exist in 1999, which means that the kind of intricate, layered detail that was laboriously hand-drawn in the early years can now be generated and modified much more quickly. This has changed what's possible in the backgrounds, allowing for more complex environments and more elaborate hidden details. But it has also changed what those details feel like. There is a quality to hand-drawn backgrounds that digital construction can approximate but not quite replicate, and fans who grew up with the early seasons sometimes find the later episodes' environments feel slightly sterile in comparison. The show's production team has occasionally addressed the Easter egg culture in interviews and commentaries, usually with the kind of cheerful acknowledgement that suggests they are genuinely pleased when viewers find these things. McFarlane has spoken about the tradition of hiding details in animated shows as something that goes back to his years working on Hanna-Barbera Productions, where animators would sometimes put little things in the background just to see if anyone noticed. That tradition carried into Family Guy and became, over time, a significant part of what makes the show rewarding to revisit. Because here is the thing about hidden details. They change the experience of rewatching. An episode that you have seen a dozen times can still surprise you if you are looking at different things than you looked at before. The foreground tells you the story. The background tells you something else, what the people making the show were thinking about, what they found funny in private, what they were communicating to the audience they hoped was paying close attention. And the best hidden details are the ones where, when you finally see them, you can feel the person who put them there smiling. Section 4. The Quagmire Files: Everything the Show Never Fully Explained. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most thoroughly constructed characters in the show's history, and also one of its most genuinely mysterious. He lives next door to the Griffins. He is their friend and their neighbor. He shows up at the Drunken Clam with Peter and Joe, and Cleveland with reliable regularity. He has a signature catchphrase that became one of the most recognized and repeated bits of comedy the show ever produced. And despite all of that presence, despite all of that consistent appearance across decades of episodes, there is an enormous amount about Quagmire that the show has never fully explained, either because the writers decided the mystery was more interesting than the answer, or because they simply hadn't figured out the answer themselves. Start with his age. This is the detail that tends to catch people off guard when they first encounter it, because Quagmire doesn't look like someone in his 70s. He is depicted visually as a man somewhere in his 30s or 40s, with a jawline that has been described as anatomically improbable and a physical vitality that doesn't suggest someone who has lived most of a century. But the show has, at various points, placed his age at somewhere between 61 and 70, with the specific number shifting slightly depending on which episode you're looking at. He was born sometime in the 1940s, which means he was alive before most of the characters in the show existed in any form. How does someone who was born in the 1940s look and act the way Quagmire does? The show doesn't really explain it. There are occasional jokes about the impossibility of his physicality, and the character's age is sometimes played for comedy. He occasionally references things from decades past in ways that suggest he genuinely has that history, but a satisfying explanation for the gap between his apparent age and his chronological age has never been provided. It's one of the show's comfortable impossibilities, the kind of thing that you accept because the alternative is spending more time on it than any episode is willing to devote. Quagmire's voice, which Seth MacFarlane has said was inspired by radio announcers of the 1940s and 1950s, is part of what makes the age mystery feel slightly less absurd. There is something about the cadence and the confidence of that voice that belongs to an older era of entertainment, to a period when a certain kind of theatrical, rhythmically precise delivery was considered the height of masculine appeal. Quagmire sounds like a man who learned to talk during the Rat Pack era and has never updated his approach, which, given his supposed age, would actually make a certain kind of sense. His physical appearance was modeled, according to multiple accounts, on an exaggerated version of Bob Hope. This is a choice that rewards attention. Bob Hope was one of the defining comedic and entertainment personalities of the mid-20th century, a man whose career stretched across radio, film, and television, whose persona was built on a combination of self-deprecating wit and performative masculine confidence. Quagmire's visual design captures something of that specific era of American entertainment masculinity: the square jaw, the confident posture, the sense of a man who has decided that the world exists primarily for his entertainment. The episode that revealed Quagmire's father is one of the most discussed and divisive in the show's history. In Season 8's Quagmire's Dad, it is revealed that Quagmire's father, who had been a decorated Navy officer and a figure Quagmire speaks of with great admiration, is a transgender woman named Ida. The episode generated significant controversy, primarily because of how it handled the subject matter. Brian's reaction to accidentally sleeping with Ida, and the extended sequence of his physical response to that discovery, was criticized by many viewers and commentators as mean-spirited and transphobic. The episode remains one of the most debated in the show's run, a case study in the difference between a show that uses a sensitive subject as material for satire and a show that simply uses the subject as a punchline. What the Quagmire's Dad episode does add to the character's background is a layer of psychological depth that the show rarely pursues in any sustained way. Quagmire's relationship with his father, the idealization of a figure who turns out to be more complicated than he appeared, the confrontation with information that challenges a foundational assumption about your own life. These are genuinely rich themes. The episode gestures at them without fully committing to exploring them, which is frustrating in proportion to how interesting they could have been. Quagmire's history with the Navy, which is referenced repeatedly across the show's run, is another area where the character's background opens up into interesting territory that is mostly left unexplored. He served, he flew planes, he has the technical skills and situational awareness that come from military aviation training. The gap between the professional competence implied by that history and the lifestyle he maintains as a civilian, the relentless, boundary-ignoring pursuit of sexual relationships that defines most of his screen time, is a contradiction that the show occasionally acknowledges but never really resolves. What happened in the Navy? How did someone with Quagmire's background become Quagmire? The show would rather make another giggity joke than answer those questions. His actual age relative to his behavior creates some of the show's most quietly unsettling background details. If Quagmire was truly born in the 1940s, then many of the situations the show places him in, his relationships with various women, his social life, his apparent freedom from any of the responsibilities that come with having lived for 7 decades, take on a different quality than they would if he were the 30-something that he visually appears to be. A 30-something man whose social life consists entirely of chasing women is one kind of character. A 70-year-old man behaving in exactly the same way is something considerably stranger, and the show has never quite decided whether to treat that strangeness as a feature or a bug. The moment in Season 8 where Quagmire delivers his famous speech about why he hates Brian is one of the most revealing scenes for both characters. Quagmire identifies, with precision and apparent genuine feeling, every significant flaw in Brian's character: the pretentiousness, the hypocrisy, the bad father who abandoned his child, the man who constantly pursues his friend's wife while claiming to be that friend's loyal companion. The speech is remarkable because it is delivered with an emotional intensity that Quagmire very rarely exhibits, and because every single accusation it contains is accurate. The speech also tells you something about Quagmire that the show rarely makes explicit. He is observant in a way that his surface behavior tends to obscure. He has been watching Brian for a long time, taking note of patterns, building a comprehensive picture of who Brian actually is versus who Brian presents himself to be. The ability to do that kind of sustained, attentive observation is not usually associated with characters defined primarily by their appetites and their reflexes. Quagmire's speech suggests that underneath the catchphrase, and the jawline, and the 7 decades of bad decisions, there is someone paying much closer attention than anyone gives him credit for. His daughter, Anna Lee Quagmire, appeared in the Season 8 episode Quagmire's Baby and then largely disappeared from the show's continuity. She was put up for adoption after Quagmire decided he couldn't care for her, which is a genuinely complex emotional situation for a character who is usually written as incapable of complexity. The episode handles it with some delicacy. Quagmire's ambivalence is real. His struggle between what he wants his life to be and what he should do for his child is given genuine weight, and then the story is essentially wrapped up and filed away. Anna Lee is mentioned occasionally in subsequent seasons, but has never been a significant presence. What is she like now? The show doesn't know, and doesn't particularly want to find out. The relationship between Quagmire and Lois is one of the show's great understated threads. Quagmire's attraction to Lois is not played as a simple running gag in the early seasons. It has genuine emotional texture, the sense of a man who has been in proximity to someone he finds remarkable for a long time and has made his peace with the fact that things will probably never go the way he wants them to. His interactions with Lois are different from his interactions with other women. He is slightly more careful, slightly more considerate, and the aggressive edge of his usual behavior is mostly absent. What he feels toward her is, in the show's terms, something close to respect. That distinction matters. The show also introduced in various later seasons a history for Quagmire that involves repeated run-ins with the law and situations that would, in a world with actual consequences, have ended with him serving significant prison time. The comedy around these situations is built on the assumption that the audience understands the character well enough to find the joke, but the accumulation of these stories over many seasons creates a background portrait of someone whose relationship with appropriate social behavior is genuinely more disturbed than the simple dirty old man caricature suggests. What Quagmire ultimately represents is the show's complicated relationship with the character of the sexual predator played for laughs. In the early seasons, his behavior is presented as extreme, but recognizably within the range of male behavior that 1990s and early 2000s comedy was comfortable depicting as funny. As the culture shifted around the show, that comfort became harder to maintain, and the show has had to navigate, not always gracefully, what to do with a character who was designed for a sensibility that has moved on. The result is a Quagmire who sometimes behaves differently in later seasons, whose most extreme behaviors are occasionally called out rather than simply celebrated, but who has never been fundamentally reimagined, because reimagining him would require acknowledging things about the early seasons that the show would rather not acknowledge. Section 5. The Death and Resurrection of Brian Griffin, a mystery with no clean answer. On the 24th of November 2013, a character on an animated comedy died. This happens regularly in animated comedies. Characters die all the time in cartoons. They fall off cliffs, they get hit by things, they meet various fates that in another genre would be tragic. In animated comedy, death is usually a reversible condition, or a punchline, or both. But when Brian Griffin was hit by a car in Season 12's episode called Life of Brian, something different happened. The show treated it seriously. The family gathered at the vet's office and said goodbye. Stewie was devastated genuinely, visibly devastated in a way that the show didn't usually allow its characters to be. The funeral was quiet and real, and a new dog named Vinny arrived, voiced by Tony Sirico in a performance that made Vinny sound exactly like a dog-shaped version of Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos, which was probably intentional. Fans responded with an intensity that the production team later admitted had caught them completely off guard. The hashtag RIP Brian trended on social media almost immediately after the episode aired. A petition to bring Brian back gathered tens of thousands of signatures within days. People were genuinely, sincerely upset, not just in the performative way that internet culture sometimes generates grief about fictional events, but in a way that suggested something deeper. Brian Griffin mattered to people. The prospect of the show continuing without him felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel. Seth MacFarlane tweeted after the episode aired, and the phrasing of what he said is worth examining carefully. He described the episode as a warm, fuzzy holiday lesson about not taking those you love for granted, because they can be gone in a flash. He did not say that Brian was dead forever. He did not confirm the permanence of what had happened, but he also didn't wink and say something was coming. The tweet was carefully balanced in a way that would have read differently depending on whether you knew the ending or not. 2 episodes later, 2 episodes, which in broadcast terms means roughly 3 weeks, Stewie used his time machine to travel back and prevent the accident. Brian was alive again. The new dog Vinny was gone. Everything returned to baseline. The question that fans immediately started asking, and have never fully stopped asking, is whether the resurrection was always planned. Was Brian's death ever intended to be permanent? Was the whole thing a stunt from the beginning, a calculated piece of audience manipulation designed to generate exactly the kind of passionate reaction that it produced? Or did the writers genuinely intend to kill Brian permanently, and then reversed course when the fan response was more intense than they had anticipated? The official answer from various members of the production team has been somewhat inconsistent. MacFarlane expressed surprise at the fan reaction, saying that the team had expected the death to create a stir but hadn't anticipated the rage. Executive producer Steve Callahan described it before the episode aired as a fun way to shake things up, language that suggests a temporary event rather than a permanent change. The replacement dog Vinny was apparently intended to be Brian's long-term successor. The decision to bring Brian back was reportedly made at least partly in response to the fan reaction, rather than having been baked into the plan from the start. But other elements of the execution suggest planning. The mechanism of the resurrection Stewie using a time travel device was already established in the show's continuity. Stewie has a time machine. It has been a recurring plot device for years. Using it to undo a catastrophic event is exactly what you would do if you were planning a resurrection from the beginning, because it gives you a logically coherent in-universe explanation for why a dead character is suddenly alive again. If Brian's death had been intended to be permanent, you would expect the writers to have taken some precaution against the obvious solution that had been sitting in Stewie's room the whole time. The 2-episode gap is also curious. If you were writing a genuine character death that was supposed to feel permanent, you would probably extend the period of absence. You would give the audience time to adjust to a new reality, to begin accepting the loss, before the circumstances of the story moved to the next chapter. 2 episodes is not enough time to do that. 2 episodes is barely enough time for the audience to stop expecting Brian to walk back in on his own. The brevity of the absence suggests either a deliberate plan to create maximum shock with minimum commitment, or a production team that responded to the fan reaction much faster than they let on publicly. What the Brian death storyline reveals about the show, regardless of how you interpret the intentions behind it, is something significant about how the production had come to understand its relationship with its own characters. Brian's death was big news. It trended. It generated coverage in mainstream media outlets that don't usually write about animated comedy. It forced people who had stopped paying close attention to the show to suddenly pay close attention again. And it did all of this without any lasting consequences, because the whole thing was reversible. This is a specific kind of storytelling move, using the emotional weight of genuine consequences without being willing to actually bear those consequences. The audience's grief was real. The show's commitment to that grief was not. And when you look at that dynamic, what you see is a show that has learned to use the tools of emotional storytelling as a mechanism for generating engagement, rather than as a genuine attempt to tell a story that matters. The audience cares about Brian. The show knows this. It used that care to create a moment that felt important and then retreated from the importance as soon as the attention it generated had been captured. After his return, Brian's behavior arguably became worse than it had been before his death. Some viewers noted that the resurrection seemed to come with a license for even more extreme characterization, as though killing and reviving the character had absolved the writers of the obligation to be careful about what he did. The episodes that followed Brian's return included some of his most objectionable moments behavior toward other characters, particularly toward Quagmire and toward women, that pushed further than it had gone before. There is also the question of what Brian's death meant for Stewie's character. The episode that revived Brian, called Christmas Guy, involves Stewie making a significant personal sacrifice to save his friend's life. He uses a time machine device that he obtained from a future version of himself, burning it in the process, which means giving up the possibility of time travel in order to undo what happened to Brian. This is not a small thing. Stewie values nothing more than his own power and independence. Giving up his most significant tool to save someone else represents a genuine act of love. That moment is widely considered one of the most emotionally effective in the show's later history, and the fact that it was made possible by Brian's death, that the only way to get to that moment of genuine Stewie vulnerability was to go through the crisis of losing Brian, suggests something complicated about the relationship between the show's shock value instincts and its occasional capacity for genuine feeling. The manipulation produced a result that was emotionally real. Whether that justifies the manipulation is a question without a clean answer. The show has never killed off any other major character in the same way, with a sudden, violent, apparently permanent death followed by a resurrection. The Brian storyline remains unique in the show's history. A discrete event that changed nothing permanently, but revealed a great deal about how the production thought about the relationship between storytelling and audience manipulation at that point in its history. It's a window into the decision-making of a show that had been running for many years and had learned, perhaps too well, what its audience would react to. Section 6. The Stewie Paradox: Evil Genius, Scared Child, or Something Else Entirely. Stewie Griffin is simultaneously the most unique character the show ever created and the most thoroughly debated, because the question of who he actually is has genuinely never been settled. Not by the show, not by the writers, not by Seth MacFarlane himself. The answer changes depending on which season you're watching, and the gap between Stewie in Season 1 and Stewie in Season 20 is large enough that they barely seem like the same person. Which raises a question worth sitting with. What does it mean for a character to change that dramatically? Is it growth? Is it loss? Is it something more complicated? In Season 1, the answer to the question of who Stewie Griffin is seems very clear. He is an evil genius. He is 1 year old, which is the biological fact at the foundation of the show's central joke, and he uses the unguarded, underestimated position of infancy as cover for an interior life of astonishing sophistication and darkness. He builds ray guns in his crib. He constructs mind control devices in his bedroom. He has designed at least 3 separate mechanisms for attempting to kill his mother, Lois, and each one is more elaborate than the last. He speaks in the measured cadences of a Bond villain, calm and precise and utterly serious about goals that should be impossible for someone who still wears a onesie. The comedy works because of the contrast. The gap between what Stewie looks like, a pudgy, big-headed baby in a yellow shirt, and what Stewie actually is, a calculating, technically brilliant would-be world conqueror, is enormous, and the show in its early seasons never let you forget either side of that gap simultaneously. You were always watching a baby who was also a monster, and the tension between those two things was where the humor lived. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that Stewie's voice was built on 2 influences: The first was Rex Harrison's performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady, a character defined by his precise, slightly contemptuous, elaborately correct way of speaking, his insistence on standards, his inability to tolerate the gap between how things are and how he believes they should be. The second was the low, evil register of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, the archetype of the patrician villain whose long life and accumulated experience have cured him of anything resembling ordinary human warmth. Put those two influences together and you get Stewie Griffin as he existed in Season 1. The precision and the contempt of Harrison, the cold menace of Burns, filtered through the absurdity of being physically incapable of most of the things he discusses with such confidence. He talks about plans for world domination while someone has to change his diaper. He designs weapons of mass disruption and then needs someone to cut his food into small pieces because he doesn't have the jaw strength yet. The jokes write themselves, and the show in those early seasons understood that perfectly. The question of whether anyone could understand Stewie was handled with a specificity that most viewers didn't fully appreciate. In the earliest episodes, it is genuinely unclear whether the adults around Stewie can understand him at all. His speeches and plans seem to be invisible to them, received as incomprehensible baby sounds, which adds the dimension of dramatic irony. The audience understands everything while the characters understand nothing. Later, this became less consistent. Some episodes suggested that people could hear and understand Stewie perfectly fine and simply chose to ignore him. Others suggested that Brian was the only one who could understand him. The inconsistency is itself a form of background mystery. The evil genius concept was retired slowly, over several seasons, and then accelerated after the Stewie Kills Lois two-parter in Season 6. MacFarlane and the writers had decided that they had explored the evil baby premise as fully as it could be explored, that continuing to do plots about Stewie trying to kill Lois or achieve world domination would feel like repetition rather than development. This was a creative judgment that is genuinely defensible. The argument that a character shouldn't be locked forever into a single defining trait, that growth and complexity are more interesting than static repetition. The problem with that argument, as many fans have pointed out, is that the replacement Stewie is much less original than the original Stewie. The new version, more emotional, more focused on his friendship with Brian, more interested in questions of personal identity and belonging, is a genuinely appealing character in many individual episodes. But there is nothing about the new Stewie that you couldn't find in dozens of other animated characters. The insecure, emotionally complicated young person who is figuring out who they are while having adventures with their best friend is a character type that animation has explored many times. There was exactly one evil genius baby who built laser guns and wanted to murder his mother between naps. The episode Send in Stewie Please, which aired in Season 16, was built around the promise of a definitive answer to the question of Stewie's sexuality, which had been hinted at and joked about and semi-confirmed and then walked back for years. Sir Ian McKellen appeared as a therapist named Dr. Cornelius Pritchfield, and the episode was structured as a single extended therapy session in which Stewie was supposed to reveal something true about himself. The revelation that actually came was that Stewie's accent is fake, that his natural speaking voice sounds less like a refined British patrician and more like Seth MacFarlane's regular speaking voice, which is to say, it sounds like Peter Griffin. The sexuality question was addressed but not answered. Stewie said explicitly that he wasn't gay, while also expressing things in the session that made a straightforward heterosexual reading of his character essentially impossible. The writer Gary Janetti, who wrote the episode, describes Stewie's uncertainty about his sexuality as something that needed to stay as is, explaining that the uncertainty gave the character a vulnerability that was essential to maintain. MacFarlane's own position, expressed in the same period, was that Stewie's sexuality should remain fluid and undefined because he is literally a one-year-old, and assigning definitive sexual orientation to a one-year-old character raises questions the show would rather leave open. The fake British accent revelation is one of the most quietly fascinating things the show has ever done. Stewie has been performing for his entire existence on screen. The voice, the bearing, the elaborate vocabulary, the whole presentation of himself as a villain of culture and refinement, none of it is natural. It is a costume that a small child constructed and never took off, which raises the question of why. Why does a baby decide to perform as a British villain? What does it mean for everything Stewie has ever said or done that it was said and done in character rather than as himself? One reading of the fake accent revelation is that it retroactively makes the entire arc of Stewie's character about performance and identity. He created a persona early in his life, whether because he was genuinely hiding something, because it felt like a form of power, because it was the only way he could survive in a household that was too chaotic to take a baby seriously as an individual, and lived inside that persona so completely that it became its own kind of truth. The evil genius wasn't a delusion, it was a choice. And choices, especially the choices you make early in your life about who you are going to be, have a way of becoming more real than the person who made them. The fan theories about Stewie are extensive and genuinely creative. One recurring theory holds that Stewie's ability to understand and engage with Brian, while the rest of the family cannot, is not a random quirk but the key to understanding the show's entire structure. The theory suggests that the show is told from Stewie's perspective, that what we see is not objective reality, but Stewie's interpretation of reality, filtered through his intelligence and his emotional state. This would explain many of the show's narrative inconsistencies, the moments where physics doesn't work the way it should, or where characters behave in ways that don't quite make sense. They make sense from inside a one-year-old's perception of the world, where cause and effect are still being learned, and where the adult's behavior is both threatening and incomprehensible. Another theory, which has been discussed across many fan communities, holds that Stewie's shift away from the evil genius characterization is not simply a creative decision by the writers, but something happening within the narrative of the show. The theory suggests that as Stewie grows and develops, even at the glacially slow pace at which animated characters age, the all-consuming ambition of his infant self is being replaced by the more complex emotional landscape of a slightly older child. His evil plans are not being abandoned. He is simply discovering that the world he wants to dominate is also a world he needs other people in, and that need is the most destabilizing thing he has ever encountered. Whether that theory is true in any meaningful sense, whether the writers intended that reading, is impossible to confirm, but it is the kind of theory that makes the character more interesting rather than less, and that seems worth something. Section 7. Lost episodes, banned broadcasts, and the content nobody was allowed to see. The list of Family Guy episodes that have been banned, pulled from broadcast, delayed for years, or quietly made inaccessible is longer and more interesting than most people realize. The show has been engaged in a running negotiation with network standards and broadcast regulations for its entire existence, and the history of that negotiation is a story about where culture draws its lines and how those lines move over time. The most famous banned episode is also the one that has been banned the longest. Partial Terms of Endearment was produced as the final episode of Season 8 in 2010. The episode concerns Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for an old friend. When the friend and her husband are killed in an accident, Lois is left with the impossible decision of what to do with the pregnancy she is carrying. The episode is, by the standards of the show that produced it, a relatively serious and carefully handled engagement with a genuinely difficult subject. The writers approached the abortion question with something close to fairness, presenting multiple perspectives, acknowledging the real complexity of the situation, avoiding the kind of easy resolution that would have made the controversy pointless. Fox refused to air it, not for any single joke or specific moment of content, but because the subject itself, a sympathetic, non-judgmental depiction of a woman genuinely considering abortion as an option, was deemed too controversial for a major American broadcast network to attach itself to. The episode aired in other countries, notably in the United Kingdom on BBC Three, where it was received without major controversy. It was released on the Season 8 DVD set. It has never aired on American television in its entirety. What makes the Partial Terms of Endearment case particularly interesting is that the episode isn't even especially provocative by Family Guy's standards. It is arguably one of the more restrained and thoughtful things the show produced during its later seasons, which makes the decision to ban it feel not like a response to genuine extremity, but like an anxiety about the subject itself. A show that had aired many episodes containing graphic violence, extended sequences of cruelty, and comedy built around sexual assault was banned not for any of those things but for treating a women's healthcare decision with nuance. The earlier banned episode, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, tells a different kind of story. This was a Season 2 episode that had been originally slated to air in 2000 but was pulled by Fox before broadcast because network executives feared it would be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode involves Peter seeking out a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein for financial advice, operating on the cultural stereotype that Jewish people are particularly skilled with money. The episode's intent, like much of Family Guy's engagement with cultural stereotypes, was satirical. The joke was supposed to be about Peter's credulity, about his willingness to believe the stereotype uncritically, not a sincere endorsement of the stereotype itself. The distinction between satirizing a stereotype and simply deploying it is one that the show has navigated with varying degrees of success throughout its history. The Weinstein episode was eventually aired on Adult Swim in 2003 and then on Fox itself in 2004, which suggests that with the passage of time and the establishment of clearer context, the network became more comfortable with what the episode was actually doing. By the time it aired, the show had accumulated enough seasons for its comedic sensibility to be well understood, which made the satirical intent of the episode legible in a way it might not have been in 2000. The episode 420, which aired in Season 7, generated enough international attention to result in Family Guy being effectively banned in Venezuela. The episode involves Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, and the Venezuelan government's response, warning cable stations that they would be fined if they continued to air the show, reflects a certain reading of the episode as straightforwardly pro-drug use rather than as the comedic exaggeration the show intended. The controversy was genuinely international in scope, one of the few times a Family Guy episode generated diplomatic-level attention. There is also the quietly fascinating case of Road to Rhode Island, one of the most beloved episodes in the show's history and the first of the Road to installments featuring Brian and Stewie on an adventure together. The episode involves a sequence where Stewie, at an airport, sings a song that distracts security while Brian smuggles weapons through the checkpoint. Following the September 11 attacks in 2001, this sequence was edited out of reruns of the episode because of the obvious sensitivity of depicting anyone bypassing airport security. The edited version of the episode is the one that most people watching today have seen, and the existence of the original complete version is something that many fans don't know about. The practice of editing episodes after their original airing is more common than the show has ever formally acknowledged. Various sequences and individual jokes have been trimmed from rebroadcasts over the years, sometimes for standards reasons that evolved between the original air date and the rerun, sometimes for legal reasons relating to specific content or imagery, and sometimes for reasons that have never been publicly explained. If you watch an episode on a streaming platform today, there is a reasonable chance that what you're watching is not identical to what aired on the original broadcast date. The question of which version is the definitive version is genuinely complicated. The show doesn't seem to have a consistent policy about which cuts are considered canonical, and different platforms may have different versions of the same episode. Hulu, which is the current streaming home of Family Guy, notably does not carry partial terms of endearment. The banned abortion episode is simply absent from its library, while every other episode of the show is available. This means that anyone watching the complete series on Hulu is missing one episode and probably doesn't know it. There is also a body of Family Guy content that was never intended for broadcast material made for promotional purposes, for DVD extras, for live events, or for internal use by the production team that occupies an interesting gray area in the show's history. MacFarlane's table read of partial terms of endearment, which was performed before a live audience in Hollywood after Fox refused to air the episode, is one example. The reading was covered in the press and generated its own kind of cultural moment, but it was not the same as the episode airing, and the people who attended or read about the table read had a different relationship to the content than the audience that eventually encountered it through other means. The Conway Twitty sequences deserve their own entry in any discussion of Family Guy content that occupies unusual space in the show's history. These were segments appearing across multiple later episodes in which, instead of a cutaway joke or any other form of comedy, the show simply broadcast a full, unedited performance of the country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs, not a clip, not a quick reference. A complete musical performance lasting several minutes, with the main narrative of the episode frozen while the audience waited for it to end. The first time this appeared, it was surprising enough to be interesting. Conway Twitty was not a name that most of Family Guy's audience had any particular connection to, and the complete non-sequitur quality of inserting a genuine country music performance into an adult animated comedy had a certain avant-garde boldness to it. By the second and third occurrence, the joke had evolved into something else, a running commentary on the show's own use of time, a kind of anti-humor that dared the audience to keep watching even when nothing was happening. By the fourth occurrence, most viewers had simply decided it was lazy. The Conway-Twitty sequences became a touchstone in critical conversations about the show's later seasons, cited as evidence of a writing room that had run out of material and was using the format as a container to pour time into rather than content. Whether that's a fair reading is debatable. There is a legitimate argument that extreme commitment to anti-humor is itself a form of craft. But the sequences remain some of the most notorious content the show ever produced, remembered not fondly but specifically, which is a kind of immortality in its own right. Section 8. The real people behind the characters where the Griffins actually came from. Every character on Family Guy came from somewhere. Not just from Seth MacFarlane's imagination, operating in isolation, but from specific observations and encounters and memories and borrowings that accumulated over years and were eventually shaped into something new. The characters feel specific because they are specific, built on real observations of real people and real voices and real behaviors that MacFarlane encountered in his life and career. Peter Griffin's voice began with a security guard, a real man, working at the Rhode Island School of Design, whom MacFarlane overheard talking at some point during his time as a student there. The specific quality of that voice, its Rhode Island working-class texture, its particular rhythm and cadence, the way it carried confidence and limitation in equal measure, stayed in MacFarlane's memory and eventually became the voice of the show's central character. MacFarlane has described the character of Peter more specifically in terms of inspiration, a man who fell asleep and began snoring during a theater showing of the 1993 film Philadelphia, the AIDS crisis drama directed by Jonathan Demme, much to the horror of his family. The combination of that image, a man who cannot manage to stay awake during a film about human suffering, surrounded by people who are embarrassed by him, and the remembered voice of the RISD security guard, produced Peter Griffin. The Peter inspiration story is interesting because Philadelphia is a specific and deliberately chosen reference. It is not a generic film, it is one of the first major Hollywood productions to address the AIDS crisis, to present a sympathetic and humanizing portrait of a gay man dying of AIDS, to insist that this story deserved to be told seriously and at scale. A man falling asleep during that particular film is not just a comedy of social awkwardness. It is a statement about a certain kind of person's relationship to empathy, to things that don't directly touch his life, to the world beyond his immediate comfort. That is early Peter Griffin, precisely, not malicious, not hateful, simply unreachable by certain kinds of human experience because he hasn't learned to reach for them. Brian Griffin is the character closest to Seth MacFarlane himself, and this is not speculation or fan theory, it is something MacFarlane has confirmed directly and repeatedly. Brian's natural speaking voice is MacFarlane's natural speaking voice. His political views are largely MacFarlane's political views. His failures as a writer, his tendency to overestimate his own literary abilities while under-delivering on the actual work, his romantic difficulties, his excessive drinking, these are exaggerations of traits that MacFarlane has described in himself with various degrees of self-deprecating honesty. MacFarlane has said publicly that of all the characters he voices, Brian is the one he has most in common with, citing their shared liberalism, their appreciation for good Scotch, and their tendency to end up in awkward situations with women. This creates an interesting dynamic for viewers who think about character authorship. When Brian behaves badly in later seasons, when he is arrogant, when he abandons his son, when he lets a woman drown because she's unavailable for dating, what does it mean that this is the character most directly based on the show's creator? Is MacFarlane indulging a form of self-criticism, allowing the character based on himself to be the show's most thoroughly vilified in some periods? Or did the later characterization of Brian drift so far from the original conception that the autobiographical connection became purely historical? Stewie's voice was built on two specific sources that MacFarlane has identified clearly. The primary inspiration was Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, which MacFarlane saw and was struck by as a model of a specific kind of refined, impatient, precisely articulated masculine authority. Harrison's Henry Higgins is a man who is absolutely certain that he knows better than everyone around him, who expresses this certainty through an elaborate and slightly theatrical precision of speech, and who is ultimately somewhat lost when he is not in a position of control. The second influence was the villainous register of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, the patrician cold menace of someone who has accumulated so much power and lived so long that ordinary human concerns no longer reach him. Lois Griffin's voice has an origin story that is touchingly accidental. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois from the pilot onward, was asked to come in and provide a voice for the character without having met MacFarlane or seen any of his artwork. She has described the experience as genuinely sight unseen. She walked in, was told what the character needed to sound like in general terms, and started performing. The voice she landed on was based on a cousin of hers, a specific woman in her family whose speaking patterns and cadences she had absorbed over years of family dinners and holidays. That real woman, unaware of her role in television history, is the foundation of one of the most recognized voices in animated comedy. Quagmire's visual design, as mentioned earlier, was built on an exaggerated version of Bob Hope's appearance. Hope's square jaw, his confident bearing, his sense of himself as the center of every room, these became the geometric language of Quagmire's character design. The voice was constructed to evoke a specific radio personality type from the 1940s and 1950s. The fast-talking, confident, slightly slick announcer who was the cultural product of a particular moment in American entertainment. Put the visual of Bob Hope together with the voice of a 1940s radio personality and age the result backwards to appear inexplicably youthful, and you have Quagmire. Chris Griffin's voice is one of the most specific and unexpected in the cast. Seth Green, who has voiced Chris since the broadcast pilot, has said that his audition involved doing an impression of Buffalo Bill, the villain from The Silence of the Lambs. This is not a straightforward connection to an awkward teenage boy. Buffalo Bill is one of the most disturbing characters in 1990s cinema, but the specific vocal quality that Green was going for, a kind of breathless, slightly unmoored energy, found its way into Chris through that strange route. The character ended up sounding nothing like a serial killer, of course, but the path to his voice ran through that unexpected place. The character of Herbert, the elderly neighbor who is written as having an attraction to Chris, is voiced by Mike Henry, who has been part of the show's creative team since the beginning. Henry met MacFarlane during their college years and was one of the first people called when the show went into production. His voice contributions to the show go far beyond Herbert. He voiced Cleveland Brown for many years before leaving the role in 2020 and contributed voices to dozens of other recurring and one-time characters. The Herbert character is one of the most controversial recurring figures in the show's history, a comedy built around pedophilia that the show has used consistently for 2 decades, and the depth of Henry's characterization, the whispery quality of the voice, the specific way the character moves through his scenes has been central to why the character landed at all. The voice of Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer neighbor, belongs to Patrick Warburton, whose naturally deep, crisp, highly confident speaking voice translates perfectly into the character's persona as a man defined by physical authority who has had to confront the radical change that comes with disability. Warburton has also voiced Kronk in The Emperor's New Groove, David Puddy in Seinfeld, and various other characters in animated and live-action productions, but Joe Swanson is the role that fans of Family Guy think of first. The gap between the voice strong, assertive, radiating physical competence and the character's situation in later seasons, where he is increasingly the butt of jokes about his disability rather than the admired neighbor of the early episodes, has not escaped notice. The production company has, at various points, acknowledged the influence of specific television shows and films on the character designs and dynamics of Family Guy. The Simpsons is the most obvious comparison and the most frequently discussed, but MacFarlane has also cited All in the Family as an important influence, specifically the dynamic of Archie Bunker, a character who is politically and socially objectionable in ways that his family is perpetually frustrated by, but who also has enough humanity to complicate simple condemnation. The Peter of the early seasons carries that dynamic forward, with the crucial modification that Peter is politically incorrect through ignorance rather than through conviction, which changes the emotional texture considerably. Section 9. The holes in time continuity errors that change what you thought you knew. Family Guy has been on the air for more than 2 decades, across more than 400 episodes, involving a cast of characters whose ages and histories and relationships have been established, modified, contradicted, reinstated, and occasionally completely reversed across that enormous body of work. The result is a continuity record that is, to put it charitably, complicated, and to put it less charitably, It is full of holes that you can fall through if you're paying attention. The most famous and enduring continuity problem involves the aging of the Griffin children. In Season 1, Meg is 15 and Chris is 13. These are established facts, part of the show's initial character Bible. Stewie is 1 year old. Over the course of many seasons, the children age at a pace that is wildly inconsistent with the passage of time. Meg turns 17 in a Season 5 episode called Peter's Two Dads, which would make sense if only 2 years had passed in the show's world between Season 1 and Season 5. But then Meg turns 18 in a Season 10 episode, implying the passage of only 1 more year across 5 additional seasons of broadcast. Chris, meanwhile, never seems to age at the same rate as Meg. Various Season 9 references establish him as 14, which would make sense if only 1 year had passed since Season 1, but creates an impossible gap when placed next to Meg's timeline. And Stewie remains 1 year old throughout all of this. A fact the show occasionally acknowledges as a joke but never explains as a story element. The inconsistency is not simply carelessness, or at least, it is not only carelessness. Animated shows have a long tradition of floating timelines, where characters age slowly or not at all, where the internal chronology of the show is subordinated to the needs of any given episode's story. The Simpsons has operated this way for decades, and viewers largely accept it because the show has been consistent about being inconsistent. Family Guy's version of the floating timeline is less disciplined, which means that the specific numbers that are mentioned in dialogue don't add up across episodes, creating contradictions that are more visible than the general situation of characters who don't age. The history of how Brian joined the Griffin family is another continuity problem that gets discussed in fan spaces. The original story, established in the early seasons, is that Brian had been homeless begging on the side of the road when Peter found him and brought him home. This is the version that is treated as canon in multiple early episodes, and it establishes Brian as someone whose past is harder and more complicated than his current comfortable domestic situation would suggest. But there is another version of Brian's backstory that was introduced later, which contradicts the original in specific ways. The episode where Brian's backstory is explored in detail doesn't quite match the original account, and the discrepancy has never been addressed or explained by the show. Whether this is an accidental error in the writer's room, someone didn't check the earlier episode before writing the new one, or a deliberate retcon that was never flagged as such is impossible to know from the outside. The pregnancy of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is one of the show's most celebrated continuity problems simply because of how long it lasted. Bonnie was visibly pregnant for approximately the first 8 seasons of the show. The character was introduced already pregnant, and remained pregnant through episode after episode, while the other characters occasionally referenced her condition as a background fact. She was pregnant for roughly 7 to 8 real-world years, which is both biologically impossible and, in the context of a show that clearly didn't care about biological possibility when it came to pregnancy, slightly impressive as a sustained joke. When Susie Swanson was finally born, in the Season 8 episode Peter's Daughter, it felt to many longtime viewers like the resolution of something they had been holding onto for so long, they had forgotten what resolution might feel like. The episode handled the birth with more emotional weight than the show usually brought to anything connected to the Swansons, perhaps acknowledging in its own way that the 8-year pregnancy had created a kind of accumulated anticipation that deserved a proper landing. The Joe Swanson family also contained another continuity puzzle in the character of Kevin Swanson, Joe's son, from before the show began. Kevin was referenced early and then disappeared for many seasons, his absence becoming a background fact that the show occasionally acknowledged but never resolved. When Kevin finally returned, it was in a significant storyline that treated his reappearance as a major event. But subsequent seasons largely returned him to the background, rendering his dramatic reappearance largely inconsequential in the long run. The giant chicken fights are perhaps the show's most internally consistent running bit, but they contain their own mysteries. The giant chicken, a giant chicken named Ernie who has been fighting Peter across many episodes across many seasons, is never given a fully satisfying explanation for why the feud began or why it has lasted so long. The original context involved a coupon dispute, but the fights have evolved so far beyond that origin that the original cause feels absurdly inadequate. More interestingly, the fights between Peter and the chicken have become progressively more elaborate and destructive. The damage caused by their battles has, in various episodes, involved destroying significant portions of infrastructure, causing casualties among bystanders, and producing consequences that would, in a realistic world, have resulted in criminal prosecution and significant legal liability. The show does occasionally acknowledge the chicken as a separate entity with his own life in some episodes. There are brief glimpses of the chicken at home with his family, living a domestic life that is completely incompatible with his behavior whenever he encounters Peter. This creates a continuity mystery of a different kind. Who is the chicken when he is not fighting? What does he do the rest of the time? How does he explain his injuries to his wife? These questions are never answered, which is probably correct, because the giant chicken is much more interesting as a pure elemental fact of the show's universe than he would be if subjected to psychological or biographical coherence. The Peter-Lois marriage is another site of significant continuity challenges. The show has established their history through multiple flashback episodes that don't always agree with each other. The story of how they met, how they got together, what their early relationship was like, these have been depicted in ways that contain small but real contradictions, usually because a later writer needed their backstory to work in a particular way and didn't check whether it was consistent with what had been established before. Section 10. Inside the Machine Production Secrets, the show never advertised. Family Guy is made in Los Angeles. The core creative team, the writers, the directors, the showrunners, the voice actors all work in the Los Angeles area, in production facilities that have changed and moved over the show's history, but have stayed anchored to the same general geographical center. But the show is not made only in Los Angeles. The animation, which is the thing that you actually see, has been produced in various overseas studios throughout the show's history, primarily in South Korea, with additional work done in other countries depending on the season. This division between where the creative decisions are made and where those decisions are drawn and colored is a fundamental fact of American animation production, and it has shaped Family Guy in ways that are both visible and less obvious. The relationship between the Los Angeles creative team and the overseas animation studios has been, at various points, a source of significant tension. Animation errors, characters going off model, colors being applied incorrectly, movements that don't match the storyboard's intention, have been a recurring feature of the show's history, with different studios producing different levels of quality and different kinds of errors. The first season of Family Guy was animated by Film Roman, a studio based in North Hollywood, which then sent work to overseas animation companies for production. The result was a visual quality that fans and critics at the time noted was rough. Characters occasionally looked slightly different from shot to shot. The colors were sometimes inconsistent, and the animation had a handmade quality that was charming in some moments and simply incorrect in others. McFarlane himself has described watching the early episodes back and noticing errors that had made it through the production process without being caught. Seasons 2 and 3 were handled by Rough Draft Studios, a company with a long history of working on American animated shows for overseas production. Rough Draft's work on Family Guy is widely considered by fans to be among the best the show has ever looked. There is a liveness and expressiveness to the character animation from this period that subsequent seasons have occasionally matched but rarely exceeded. The show's cancellation at the end of Season 3 meant that Rough Draft's involvement ended, and when the show returned for Season 4 with different studios, the visual change was immediately noticeable. The writing room is a space that has changed substantially over the show's history. In the original seasons, the room was small and the team was tight. McFarlane assembled writers who knew each other and who shared a sensibility that he had cultivated during the development process. The show's cancellations scattered that team, and each return to production required rebuilding the room with a new combination of returning veterans and new hires. By the later seasons, the room is much larger and more structured than it was in the beginning, with a formal hierarchy of showrunners, executive producers, supervising producers, co-producers, and staff writers that reflects the scale of a show that has been running for decades. The process of making an episode begins with pitching in the writer's room, where writers suggest story ideas that are then developed through discussion into outlines, then into scripts, then through a table read with the voice cast, then through revisions, then into production. The cycle from initial pitch to finished episode takes approximately a year, which means that the writer's room is always working on episodes that will air roughly 12 months in the future. This long lead time creates a specific challenge for a show that occasionally wants to engage with current events by the time a topical joke or reference has been written, storyboarded, voiced, animated, and broadcast. The specific moment it was responding to is often a year in the past. The voice recording process is another area where the show's production differs in interesting ways from what most viewers imagine. The voice cast does not typically record together in the same room. Instead, each actor records their lines separately, with Seth MacFarlane often doing multiple sessions for multiple characters. The conversations that sound like two people talking to each other in the finished episode were, in the recording studio, two separate performances recorded at different times that were assembled together in editing. The connection between the performers that seems natural in the finished product is constructed in post-production rather than present in the recording. This separation has implications for the kind of comedy the show can do. When two characters interact in a Family Guy scene, the rhythm of that interaction is established not in the room between the performers, but in the editing bay and the storyboard, by people who are imagining the timing rather than experiencing it. The very best moments of comedic timing in the show, the pauses, the overlaps, the moments where one character's reaction perfectly matches another's delivery, are achieved through careful editing rather than through two performers genuinely reacting to each other in real time. It is a different kind of craft, requiring a different set of skills, but it is craft nonetheless. The show's music is another underappreciated dimension of the production. Walter Murphy, who has served as the show's composer for much of its history, works within a tradition of American animated comedy, scoring that values flexibility and pastiche, the ability to move quickly between different musical styles and references, to support a joke by choosing exactly the right musical register, to undercut a sincere moment with precisely calibrated irony, or to lift one with unexpected warmth. The music in Family Guy is more sophisticated than most viewers consciously register, operating in the background of scenes in ways that shape the emotional tone without announcing themselves. The show's Emmy nomination in 2009 for Outstanding Comedy Series was genuinely historically significant. It was the first time an animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, a gap of almost 50 years, across which The Simpsons, arguably the most critically acclaimed animated comedy in American television history, had never received the same recognition. That Family Guy was the show to break that barrier rather than The Simpsons is a fact that tends to surprise people when they first hear it, partly because The Simpsons' critical reputation in its peak years was so much more consistent and substantial. The show has also had to navigate the specific challenges of a long-running production's relationship with its own continuity of cast and crew. Voice actors have died, retired, or become unavailable. Writers have left for other projects. Directors and showrunners have come and gone. The show that airs today has very few remaining connections to the original team that made the first season, and yet it maintains the visual and auditory identity of those early episodes because the fundamental character designs and voice performances have been preserved and replicated across hundreds of episodes. The show is a kind of ship of Theseus, gradually every plank replaced, but the vessel still recognizably itself. Section 11. The Meg Conspiracy: What the Show Was Really Saying All Along. The treatment of Meg Griffin across the show's run is one of those subjects that can feel overwhelming to describe comprehensively because the material is so extensive and because the implications are so uncomfortable to sit with. But sitting with it is worth doing, because the story of what happened to Meg is not simply a story about a character on a cartoon. It is a story about what a roomful of writers, across many seasons, decided was acceptable to do to a teenage girl, and what it reveals about how the show thought about certain kinds of people. In the first season, Meg is written as a recognizable person. She is 15 years old. She is a teenager at a high school in a small city in Rhode Island, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. She is not popular. She does not have a large circle of friends. She wants to be liked and struggles to achieve it. She has a crush on a boy who doesn't know she exists. She is embarrassed by her family in the way that teenagers are embarrassed by families that are louder and more chaotic than they would choose. She is ordinary, and ordinarily, which is to say, genuinely relatable. The earliest jokes at Meg's expense are built on this ordinariness. She is the most boring member of a family that includes a baby criminal mastermind and a dog who drives a car. The comedy of her character in Season 1 comes from the contrast between how exceptional everyone around her is and how thoroughly conventional she is. It is not mean humor. It is a recognizable social comedy about being the least interesting person in a room full of interesting people, which is an experience that a significant portion of the show's audience probably knew firsthand. What happened next happened slowly, and it is the slowness that makes it particularly worth examining. The shift from Meg being boring to Meg being ugly is not a single decision that was made in a single writer's room meeting. It accumulated across seasons, one joke at a time, as the writers discovered that a certain kind of humor built on contempt for Meg's appearance and desirability, got a reaction and kept coming back to it. The creative logic is easy to follow. You find something that works, you do it again, you do it more intensely. The problem is that the thing that was working was building a model of humor that treated a specific character's existence as inherently ridiculous, her body as inherently wrong, her desire to be treated with basic dignity as somehow comic in itself. By the later middle seasons, roughly season 6 through season 12, Meg's mistreatment had become one of the defining features of the show. Peter would describe in detail his contempt for his daughter, while her mother sat nearby without objection. The show presented abandonment of Meg, humiliation of Meg, and physical harm to Meg as reliable laugh generators, returning to them with a frequency that moved the content from comedy into something harder to categorize. Individual jokes can be defended as comedy. Hundreds of jokes across hundreds of episodes, all aimed at the same target, all reinforcing the same message that this character deserves what she gets constitutes something different. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, which aired in season 10, is the most frequently discussed Meg episode precisely because of how the show chose to resolve the conflict it had been building for years. The episode puts the Griffin family in the house during a hurricane, isolating them from the outside world and forcing them to sit with each other for an extended period. Meg, who has absorbed cruelty from her family for years, finally reaches her limit. She confronts them. She tells her parents what they have done to her. She describes with accuracy and emotion the specific damage that Peter's behavior has caused. She tells Lois about her failures as a mother. She is honest in a way the character has never been allowed to be, and for a brief, startling moment, the show seems to be preparing to let Meg win. Then it reverses. The family, without Meg as a shared target, collapses in on itself. They turn their cruelty on each other. The structure that kept the household functioning depended on Meg absorbing the worst of everyone's frustration and resentment, and without her in that role, the family cannot maintain itself. The episode ends with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily agreeing to take back her confrontation. She accepts her role as the family's punching bag because she understands that without her in that position, her family will destroy itself. She sacrifices her dignity for the family's stability. The reading of that ending that the show seemed to intend was comic dark, a joke about how dysfunctional families stay together. But the reading that many viewers, particularly younger viewers who identified with Meg's position, actually received was something that sounded like, victims should accept their victimization because challenging it is selfish. This is not a reading that the show appeared to have considered carefully before landing on it, and the fan response to the episode was strongly negative in ways that went beyond aesthetic objection into genuine moral critique. The Meg conspiracy theory that circulates in fan spaces is less a traditional hidden information conspiracy and more a reading of the character's function that the show never made explicit, but that the evidence supports. The theory holds that Meg is the show's scapegoat in a structural sense, that the family's ability to function depends on having someone to project their worst impulses onto, and that the show's own comedic structure depends on having a character whose suffering can be treated as inherently funny. Meg is not a character with a story. She is a mechanism, and the mechanism is specifically designed to absorb. What makes the Meg situation particularly interesting from a production history perspective is that the improvement in her treatment in later seasons, which did happen gradually, from around season 14 onward, has been partly credited by people familiar with the writer's room to the addition of more women to the writing staff. When the room included more writers who could identify with Meg's experience, or who simply objected to what the show was doing with the character, the humor around her shifted. Not completely, and not all at once, but meaningfully. By season 22, the most extreme abuse had largely stopped, and Meg was occasionally given storylines where she was competent, resilient, and even quietly heroic. The fact that this shift happened, and that it happened in correlation with changes in who was in the room, tells you something important about where the earlier characterization came from. It came from a room that was not thinking carefully about what it was building, season by season, joke by joke. It came from a room that was following the comic logic of getting a reaction and coming back to the thing that got a reaction, without sufficient consideration of the cumulative effect of what they were building. The actress Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since season 2, has spoken publicly about the experience of having her character become the show's primary target. She has mentioned that people would sometimes use the phrase "Peter directs at Meg" when addressing her in public, repeating the catchphrase to the real woman who gave the character her voice. The bleed of the fictional cruelty into her real life is a consequence that the writers almost certainly did not consider when they were writing the jokes, but it represents the actual human cost of comedic choices that are made without thinking about who is on the receiving end. Section 12. The unsolved mysteries, questions that were never meant to be answered. There are things about Family Guy that will never be resolved. Not because the show ran out of time or because the writers were being coy, but because some things about a fictional world are simply not determined. They exist in the space between the text and the audience, and the moment an official answer is given, something is lost. The most enduring of these is the question of whether anyone actually understands Stewie. The show has never been fully consistent about this. In some episodes, adults respond to Stewie's perfectly articulated speech in ways that suggest they can understand him. In others, his words appear to be received as incomprehensible baby sounds. Brian clearly understands him, and a few other characters have understood him in specific episodes for reasons that were never explained. The inconsistency is most likely a production oversight rather than a deliberate mystery, but it has generated one of the richest areas of fan speculation about the show. The theory that the entire show exists within Peter's mind, a kind of elaborate coping mechanism for a tragedy that happened in the real world, is one of the most frequently discussed and enduringly popular readings of the first show's structure. In this reading, the inconsistencies, the bizarre events that leave no lasting consequences, the characters who behave in ways that make no psychological sense, the children who don't age, all of these are explained by the fact that we are not seeing reality. We are seeing Peter's reconstruction of his life, shaped by grief and guilt and the specific cognitive distortions of a man who cannot fully process what has happened to him. The fan theory that the show exists in two separate universes, one for the pre-cancellation seasons and one for the post-cancellation revival, offers a different framework for understanding the character changes that occurred between 2002 and 2005. In this reading, the Stewie and Brian, who traveled back in time in the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, did not actually visit the past. They crossed into a parallel universe in which the show's history proceeded differently. This would explain why the characters who returned from cancellation in 2005 are different from the characters who existed before it. They are different people, from a different world, wearing the same names and faces. The question of whether Meg is actually Stewie's biological mother is the kind of fan theory that sounds absurd until you look at the evidence. In the banned abortion episode Partial Terms of Endearment, there is a moment where Lois mentions Meg having given birth to Stewie and then immediately tries to play it off as a joke. Most viewers read this as the show being playful and self-referential, acknowledging fan theories it found amusing. But the specific delivery of the line, and the way Lois moves past it quickly, has kept the theory alive. What if it wasn't a joke? What if it was a piece of information that was always going to be too strange to fully commit to? The theory would explain several things. It would explain Stewie's particular emotional distance from Lois. He is not hostile to his mother so much as he is hostile to the woman he believes to be his mother. It would explain why Meg and Stewie have such a different kind of dynamic than any other pair of characters on the show. There is an underlying tension between them that goes beyond simple sibling friction. It would explain elements of Stewie's character that feel like the traits of someone who is processing a complicated family secret without being fully aware of what the secret is. The theory about Brian's origin, that he is not a dog who was given human intelligence through some unexplained process, but a human whose consciousness was placed into a dog's body, similar to what happened to the goldfish Klaus in American Dad, has been discussed for years without resolution. The two shows exist in a connected universe. The crossover between them has been acknowledged on screen. If the technology to place a human consciousness into a fish is available in that universe, why not into a dog? It would explain Brian's extraordinary intelligence, his human social skills, his ability to drive a car and write a novel, not as the natural capacities of a genetically exceptional dog, but as the residual abilities of a human who still has all his memories and capabilities, just in a different body. The existence of a fourth Griffin child, a child who was born and died before the show's events, who appears in brief references and background details across multiple episodes, is one of the quieter mysteries in the show's history. There are moments where a character mentions a sibling who is not among the 4 Griffin children we know, references to events that seem to involve a person who should be present but isn't. Whether this is a deliberate buried storyline that was never fully developed, or simply a series of continuity errors that happen to form a suggestive pattern when viewed together, is genuinely unclear. The show's relationship with its own timeline, with the question of when these events are happening and how time passes within the show's world, has never been formally addressed. The show exists in a kind of temporal flexibility, where it can be the 1990s for one episode and the present for the next, where characters remember events from decades ago but have not aged accordingly, where the technology and cultural references of specific historical moments can be invoked without the characters being bound by those moments. This is normal for animated shows, but Family Guy's version of it has produced specific mysteries that the floating timeline doesn't quite explain away. The question of what Joe Swanson would be like if he could walk again, whether he would still be the same person, whether the wheelchair has shaped his identity in ways that would persist even if the physical limitation were removed, was addressed in one episode through a medical procedure that restored his mobility. The show explored this briefly and then returned him to his wheelchair, apparently deciding that a mobile Joe was less useful to the show's comedic structure than a Joe in a wheelchair. But the episode raised questions about identity and disability that it didn't have time to answer, and those questions linger in the background of every subsequent Joe storyline. The giant chicken's name is Ernie. This is established in the show. Ernie the giant chicken lives in the same fictional world as the Griffin family, apparently holds a full-time job, has a wife, and presumably some kind of social life, and also periodically engages Peter Griffin in catastrophic street brawls that have caused significant property damage and casualties. The question of how these two aspects of Ernie's existence relate to each other, how the chicken, who is apparently a normal member of society, explains his injuries, his absences, his periodic involvement in city-destroying combat, has never been addressed. The most fundamental unsolved mystery of the show is also the simplest. What does the show actually think about its characters? Not in terms of what happens to them, but in terms of what the show believes about them as people. Does it think Peter is redeemable? Does it think Brian knows what he is? Does it think Meg deserves better? The show has, at various points, answered these questions in ways that contradict each other, suggested values that it then abandoned, demonstrated moments of genuine warmth that it then undercut. What does Family Guy actually believe? The honest answer is probably that it doesn't have a single answer. A show made by many different people over many years, shaped by changing creative teams and shifting cultural contexts, and the practical demands of producing 20 episodes a season for 2 decades, is not capable of having a consistent philosophy. It has individual moments of clarity, individual episodes where something true is said, and the show commits to it for the duration of that episode, and then the moment passes and the show returns to being whatever it needs to be next week. That inconsistency is one of the things that makes it endlessly fascinating to come back to. You never quite know which version of the show you're going to encounter on any given night. Sometimes you find something that reminds you of why you cared about it in the first place. Sometimes you find something that makes you wonder how it got this far. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, in a background detail or a line of dialogue that nobody seems to be paying attention to, you find something that feels like a secret, something placed there for exactly the kind of person who is paying close enough attention to see it. That person, if you have made it this far, is you. Thank you for spending this time with these stories. These mysteries, these quiet corners of a show that has existed longer than many of its viewers have been alive, are worth thinking about slowly and carefully. They don't all have answers. Some of them were never meant to, but the act of sitting with them, of turning them over and looking at them from different angles in the dark, is its own kind of pleasure. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight, please leave a like on this video. It does genuinely help. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss when something new goes up. And drop a comment, tell me which of these mysteries sat with you the longest, which one you're still thinking about. Those conversations are some of the best parts of making these videos, and I read all of them. Sleep well, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one. End of script. Section 1 expanded deeper into the lost pilot. There is something that gets lost in the official story of Family Guy's creation, the story that goes from thesis film to Fox pitch to Super Bowl debut, and that something is the sheer improbability of what actually happened. Consider what McFarlane was doing in 1997. He had an animation degree. He had worked for Hanna-Barbera on children's shows. He had made one short film that aired on Cartoon Network alongside other experimental shorts, most of which you have never heard of and never will. He was 23 years old, and he was about to pitch a show to one of the 4 major American broadcast networks with a budget of $50,000 that would have covered roughly 1.5 minutes of a professional animated production. The math of what he accomplished with that budget is genuinely staggering when you look at it carefully. A 15-minute animated pilot containing multiple characters, multiple locations, multiple sequences of action and dialogue produced at professional broadcast quality for a sum that contemporary animators describe as closer to a passion project budget than a network pitch budget. McFarlane has described the 6 months he spent working on the pilot as animating like crazy at home, a phrase that understates what that actually means. He was doing the work of an entire production studio by himself, in his apartment every day for half a year. The specific quality of what he achieved in that $50,000 pilot, not just the content, but the execution was good enough to get a network greenlight. That tells you something about McFarlane's technical abilities that the conversation about his creative output tends to obscure. He is often discussed primarily as a humorist, a voice performer, a creator of comedic characters. Less often discussed is the fact that he is also a technically capable animator who could, at 23, produce work that satisfied the requirements of a major broadcast network working essentially alone. When the pitch pilot was recently found on animator Robert Paulson's website, the discourse around its discovery was primarily about what was different, the voices, the character designs, the specific jokes that survived versus the ones that were cut. But it is equally worth paying attention to what was already complete. The fundamental comedic sensibility of the show, the combination of domestic family comedy with genuinely dark humor, the cutaway structure, the specific dynamic between Peter and Brian as complementary opposites was fully present in that $50,000 film. McFarlane did not discover what the show was through the process of making 16 seasons. He knew what it was in 1997. The pitch pilot also contains a specific sequence that was edited out of the broadcast version and that fans who have now seen the complete film find particularly interesting. In the scene where Peter misreads a newspaper headline because he has toothpaste on the paper, the specific joke that plays out in the pitch pilot is slightly different from the version that made it to broadcast. The rhythm of the gag is slightly different, the timing of Brian's sardonic response is slightly different, and the overall effect is almost but not quite the same. These micro differences in comic timing between the pilot and the broadcast version offer a window into how precisely McFarlane was working when he made the final version, how carefully he calibrated even small moments of comedic timing in the revision process. The casting differences between the pilot and the broadcast version also tell a story that is easy to underappreciate. The choice to bring in Seth Green for Chris was not simply a cosmetic change, it fundamentally altered what the character could be, because Green brought a specific quality to the role that McFarlane's version of the character couldn't quite access. McFarlane's Chris, which you can hear in the pilot, is technically competent but lacks the particular brand of gentle, slightly spacey earnestness that Green's interpretation gave the character. That earnestness is part of what makes Chris one of the show's most consistently likable characters across all its seasons, and it was not fully present until Green took over. The decision to cast Lacey Chabert as the original Meg, and then Mila Kunis from Season 2 onward, is another casting story with implications that go beyond simple voice replacement. Chabert's Meg has a slightly different quality from Kunis's, a slightly more clearly defined frustration, a sharper edge of teenage irritation that Kunis's version softened somewhat. Whether this difference matters for the character's overall arc is debatable, but the change between the two performances is real enough that longtime fans can often tell, in recordings where they aren't certain which actress is performing, which voice they're hearing. Section 2 expanded more. From the vault. The specific circumstances under which episodes were cut also reveal things about the power structure of the show's production. When a network executive calls and tells the showrunner that a scene needs to come out, that is a different kind of deletion than when the showrunner looks at the edited episode and decides something is wrong with the pacing. Executive interference leaves a particular kind of trace. The cut is often abrupt. The joke it was building toward doesn't quite resolve. The setup remains while the punchline has been surgically removed. In the early seasons, Fox's Standards and Practices Department was particularly active in its oversight of Family Guy content. The show had been marketed to Fox as adult animation in the tradition of The Simpsons, but it was pushing into territory that The Simpsons rarely explored: more explicit sexual humor, more graphic violence, more direct engagement with subjects that broadcast standards were specifically designed to avoid. The back and forth between the show's writers and the network censors in those early seasons was essentially an ongoing negotiation about how far adult animation on broadcast television could actually go. What is remarkable about the material that survived those negotiations is that it represents the writers choosing their battles carefully. They pushed hard on some things and gave way on others, and the pattern of what they pushed on and what they conceded reveals what they considered essential to the show's identity versus what was negotiable. The dark humor around Stewie was almost never walked back. The political comedy was usually allowed through with modifications rather than wholesale cuts. The most controversial material tended to involve sexuality, and this is where the most content was removed or significantly altered. The deleted material from the show's middle seasons, roughly seasons 8 through 12, is interesting for a different reason. By this point, the show had established its identity, and the network had a much clearer picture of what it was willing to air. The deletions from this era are less about content that was too extreme for broadcast and more about material that the writers themselves decided wasn't working: jokes that didn't land in the table read, storylines that got too complicated to resolve in 22 minutes, character moments that felt out of step with the tone the show had settled into by that point. The table read process, which involves the voice cast reading through a completed script before production begins, is one of the places where content gets quietly removed without anyone outside the production ever knowing about it. A joke that reads well on the page can fall flat when performed, and the reverse is also true. A line that seems ordinary in script can explode in the room when a voice actor finds something unexpected in it. The decisions made in the table read about what to cut, what to expand, and what to completely revise shape the episode significantly before a single frame is drawn. Seth MacFarlane's particular method of voicing 4 major characters simultaneously creates unusual dynamics in these table reads. He is simultaneously the creator, the showrunner at certain points in the show's history, and the performer of Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire. When MacFarlane performs a scene in the table read and decides it isn't working, he is making a judgment as a performer and as a creative executive simultaneously. The decisions he makes in that moment carry more weight than a decision made by any other person in the room, and they happen faster, with less deliberation, than decisions made in other contexts. Section 3. Expanded, deeper background details. There is one category of background detail that deserves much more attention than it usually receives, and that is the recurring appearance of specific objects across multiple episodes in ways that suggest careful internal continuity that the show has never publicly acknowledged. Across many seasons, attentive viewers have noticed that certain objects appear in the Griffin home in specific configurations that don't change arbitrarily, that the production design of the house is more carefully maintained than the show's reputation for continuity errors would suggest. This is partly a function of animation production software, which allows background artists to maintain consistent environments by reusing and modifying digital assets rather than redrawing backgrounds from scratch. But it also reflects a specific decision to treat the Griffin family home as a real place, with its own logic and history, rather than simply a set that can be reconfigured to serve any episode's needs. The commitment to maintaining the home's visual identity is one of the show's quieter production achievements. The framed photographs on the walls of the Griffin home are particularly interesting when examined carefully. Some of these photographs depict characters who appear in the show. There are images that correspond to specific characters in specific scenes from earlier episodes. Others depict settings or situations that have never appeared in the show's narrative, which has led fans to speculate about whether these constitute visual references to events in the character's history that were never depicted on screen. Whether this is intentional layering by the production design team or simply the reuse of stock image assets is impossible to confirm from outside the production. The neighborhood of Spooner Street, where the Griffins live, has a physical layout that the show has maintained with relative consistency across its history. The relationship between the Griffin house and the adjacent properties, the Swanson house next door, the route to the Quagmire property, the direction toward the Drunken Clam has been kept coherent enough that fans have created maps of the neighborhood that, while not definitive, are internally consistent with most episodes. The show doesn't call attention to this consistency, which makes it more interesting. When you notice it, the production team clearly thought about the physical space the characters inhabit, even when that thinking was invisible to the audience. The show has also used background details as a form of commentary on specific episodes' themes that is entirely separate from the main narrative. In episodes that deal with Peter's mortality or the fragility of the family's circumstances, the background details in the Griffin home are sometimes subtly different. Objects are slightly displaced. The color palette of certain rooms shifts almost imperceptibly. Small elements of disorder appear in spaces that are usually neat. Whether the audience consciously registers these changes, most viewers don't. But the effect of these small shifts on the overall emotional texture of a scene has been analyzed by fans who watch the show with unusual attention to visual information. Section 4 expanded the Quagmire files. Continued. There is one more dimension of Quagmire's character history that is worth examining carefully, and it involves the question of what the show has been willing to acknowledge about the actual content of his behavior versus what it prefers to frame as comedy. Quagmire's most extreme behavior, particularly in the later seasons, crosses lines that the show plays as jokes but that, when described plainly, describe conduct that in any realistic context would be criminal. The show's decision to use a character defined primarily by sexual predation as a vehicle for comedy is not unique to Family Guy. There is a long tradition in American humor of treating the lecherous older man as a comic type, rather than a threat. But Quagmire's version of this character type has been taken to extremes that exceed what the tradition usually accommodates. The accumulation of specific behaviors across many seasons, when cataloged, constitutes a pattern that is harder to laugh at the further you get from any single instance of it. The episode Quagmire's Mom addressed some of this directly. When Quagmire is arrested and convicted for statutory rape after sleeping with a girl who lied about her age, the episode gives Quagmire a genuinely difficult situation to navigate. He committed an act that is legally criminal while being subjectively unaware of the victim's age, and it treats his legal culpability with more seriousness than you might expect from a show that has spent years playing his behavior for laughs. The character's mother, voiced by Allison Janney, is herself revealed to have been a contributor to his behavioral patterns through her own conduct, adding a layer of psychological explanation that the show rarely extends to Quagmire. But the episode is also not a turning point in how the show presents Quagmire. The specific situation of the episode is resolved, and then the character returns to his usual characterization without significant modification. This is consistent with the show's general approach to consequences. They happen within an episode, and then they don't persist. The Quagmire who exists at the beginning of the next episode is the same Quagmire who existed before the events of Quagmire's Mom. The legal conviction, the family confrontation, the psychological insight, none of it changes what we see on screen the following week. Section 5 expanded Brian's death. Continued. The choice of Vinny as Brian's replacement is itself a mystery worth examining. Tony Sirico was a specific casting choice for a character who was very clearly designed as a short-term placeholder, a character the audience was meant to like enough to make the week-to-week experience of Brian's absence bearable, but not enough to genuinely mourn when Brian returned and Vinny disappeared. The Sopranos veteran's vocal qualities transferred almost perfectly to an animated dog character in ways that were both unexpected and immediately legible. Vinny's brief existence as a character on the show raises a question that the show did not address. What happened to Vinny after Brian came back? In the logic of the show's universe, Stewie traveled back in time to prevent Brian's accident, which means Brian was never hit by the car, which means the events that led to Vinny coming to the Griffin home never happened. Vinny, in the revised timeline, presumably never met the Griffins, never became part of their household, and has simply continued living whatever life he was living before the accident. He exists now in a timeline that the show abandoned, a character whose reality was unmade by the same mechanism that restored his predecessor. The fan community has occasionally speculated about whether Vinny could return in some form, whether a show willing to use time travel as a narrative device could find a reason to revisit a character who exists in an alternate timeline. This has not happened, and the probability that it will is low, but the idea points to something interesting about how the show uses its own internal logic selectively. Time travel is invoked when it serves a specific narrative purpose and then set aside until it is needed again, rather than being treated as a permanent feature of the show's world that should produce consistent consequences. Section 6 expanded. The Stewie paradox. Continued. The evil genius Stewie has not entirely disappeared from the show. He appears in occasional episodes, particularly in later seasons, when the writers want to invoke the original character's energy for a specific comedic purpose. These appearances have a particular quality they feel like a greatest hits performance of the original Stewie, the writers invoking a character they mostly retired in order to generate a specific kind of comedic impact that the current Stewie cannot quite provide. The contrast between these moments and the character's usual later seasons presentation is itself a form of commentary on what was lost. Some of the most interesting late-season Stewie moments involve the character briefly glimpsing a future version of himself. In multiple episodes across the show's run, various mechanisms have allowed Stewie to encounter versions of himself from other timelines or from the future. These future Stewies are consistently different from the one we know, more resolved, more openly themselves, having made decisions and arrived somewhere that the current Stewie has not yet reached. What is revealing is that none of these future versions is a world-conquering dictator. The evil genius goal has apparently been abandoned in every plausible future the show has imagined. Whether this represents a quiet endorsement of the writer's decision to move the character away from his original characterization, the show itself, in some sense, confirming that evil Stewie was always a phase, or simply reflects the practical difficulty of depicting a successful world domination in the format of an animated sitcom, is unclear. But it is interesting that in imagining Stewie's future, the show consistently imagines someone different from the character who debuted in 1999. The relationship between Stewie and Rupert, his stuffed bear, is one of the most enduring and peculiar elements of the character across all seasons. In the early years, Rupert was a prop, a toy that Stewie carried around as part of his visual characterization as a baby, with occasional jokes about the gap between how he talked about Rupert and what Rupert actually was. In the later seasons, Rupert has become something considerably more significant to Stewie, a confidant, an object of real emotional attachment, a presence in Stewie's life that functions something like a relationship. The episode where Brian destroys Rupert while drunk is one of the show's most discussed moments of Brian behaving unforgivably. He destroys Stewie's most valued possession out of irritation, and then minimizes the significance of what he has done, because the significance is emotional rather than material, and the later seasons Brian has difficulty taking emotional significance seriously when it belongs to someone else. The destruction of Rupert is not repaired, unlike Brian's death. Unlike many other devastating events in the show, it simply happened and remained happened. This makes it one of the show's few genuine permanent consequences, which is perhaps why it lands so hard. Section 7 Expanded Banned Content. Continued. The road to Family Guy's most significant censorship battles runs through the parents' television advocacy groups that were active during the show's first decade on air. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog organization, placed Family Guy on its annual list of worst primetime shows for family viewing multiple times in the early 2000s, and the Federal Communications Commission received complaints about specific episodes that prompted formal reviews of whether the content violated broadcast indecency standards. The FCC complaints about Family Guy in the early 2000s were part of a broader moment in American broadcast standards history, when the definition of acceptable primetime content was being contested with unusual intensity. The Janet Jackson wardrobe incident during the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show crystallized this debate in a specific and high-profile way, and the subsequent crackdown on broadcast content affected Family Guy directly. The show's production team was more cautious in the seasons immediately following 2004 about what they included in episodes, not because they had changed their creative values, but because the regulatory environment had changed. MacFarlane's response to the censorship battles was characteristically direct. He considered the show's confrontations with broadcast standards to be a feature rather than a bug, evidence that the show was engaging with material that mattered enough to upset people, rather than producing the kind of comfortable, inoffensive content that generates no reaction at all. This attitude toward censorship as evidence of cultural relevance has informed the show's approach to controversial material throughout its history, with the caveat that the value of causing offense depends entirely on whether what you're doing with the offense is actually saying something. The specific case of Turban Cowboy, a season 11 episode that included a joke that seemed, in light of events that occurred after the episode aired, to predict or reference the Boston Marathon bombing, created a different kind of controversy than any of the previous censorship battles. The episode contained a sequence involving cars and a crowd that, when the Boston bombing happened shortly after the episode's original broadcast, caused the show's rebroadcast to be pulled temporarily. MacFarlane expressed regret about the coincidence, and the episode remained unavailable for a period before returning to the rotation. The Turban Cowboy case is interesting because it represents a kind of censorship that has nothing to do with the content of the episode itself. The episode wasn't pulled because it was offensive or because it violated broadcast standards, but because circumstances external to the episode made one of its jokes seem different in retrospect. This is a category of problem that television production cannot easily anticipate or prevent, and it illustrates a specific vulnerability of comedy that engages with real-world events and imagery. Section 8 expanded real people behind the characters. Continued. The character of Herbert, the elderly neighbor who represents one of the show's most persistently controversial comedic choices, has a voice and a characterization that Mike Henry developed through specific research and observation, rather than through simple exaggeration. Henry has described the process of finding Herbert's voice as involving careful attention to the specific quality of elderly men's voices in certain circumstances, the softness, the breathiness, the particular way that someone speaking carefully and quietly sounds different from someone speaking with normal volume and projection. What made Herbert a recurring character rather than a one-appearance guest is the level of detail that Henry brought to the performance. The character has specificity beyond the joke, a specific physical way of moving, a specific relationship to the other characters on the show, a specific kind of humor that is dark but not random. The joke of Herbert is not simply that he is a pedophile. It is that the show presents him as a complete person, with routines and relationships and a specific sense of himself, and that completeness is what makes the character disquieting in a way that pure shock humor never could. The character of Tom Tucker, the news anchor who delivers the show's fictional news segments, is a MacFarlane creation that has remained remarkably consistent across the show's history. Tucker exists in a specific tradition of local television news anchor parody that was well established before Family Guy, but MacFarlane's version of the character has a particular quality of self-regard that distinguishes it. Tucker believes himself to be genuinely important and genuinely talented, and his newscast takes itself seriously in ways that the actual events it covers never justify. The gap between Tucker's self-perception and the reality of what he is covering is the engine of most Tucker-related comedy. The character of Stewie's therapist in Send in Stewie Please, played by Sir Ian McKellen, is worth examining as a casting choice in detail. McKellen is one of the most celebrated British actors alive, a figure whose work spans Shakespeare, contemporary drama, and blockbuster franchise films, and whose personal history as an openly gay man and a longtime advocate for LGBTQ rights made him a specific and loaded choice for an episode that was, at least in part, about sexuality. The choice to use McKellen for an episode that grappled, however obliquely, with Stewie's sexuality was deliberate and layered in ways that the episode itself acknowledged. The character of Diane Simmons, Tom Tucker's on-air partner who became a murderer in the Season 9 episode And Then There Were Fewer, is voiced by Laurie Allen, who has been part of the show since the pilot. The decision to kill off Simmons was a significant creative choice, removing a character who had been part of the show's world since the beginning, and the manner of her death shot by Stewie, who has discovered she is responsible for the episode's murders, brought back the evil genius Stewie energy that had been largely absent for several seasons. The juxtaposition of the formal dinner party murder mystery setup with Stewie's casual assassination was one of the more effective deployments of the character's dark side in the show's later history. Section 9 Expanded Continuity. Errors. Continued. The show's treatment of death as a reversible condition for some characters and an irreversible one for others creates one of its most interesting internal consistencies, or rather, inconsistencies. Characters who have been killed off and then returned to life include Brian Griffin, who was resurrected by Stewie's time travel, and various minor characters who have died in specific episodes and then appeared alive in subsequent ones without explanation. But other characters who have died, Mr. Weed, Diane Simmons, various background characters who met explicit ends have stayed dead. The distinction between who can be resurrected and who stays dead does not appear to operate according to any principle that the show has ever made explicit. It seems to be a function of how significant a specific character is to the ongoing show, how much their absence would cost the production, versus how much their presence adds to any given episode. This is entirely sensible from a practical production standpoint, but it creates a world in which death has no consistent meaning, which is a problem for a show that occasionally wants to use death as a mechanism for genuine emotional impact. The Griffin family's house has been destroyed multiple times across the show's run, in fires, explosions, structural collapses, and various other catastrophes, and has been restored to its original state in every subsequent episode. This is completely standard for animated comedy. The Springfield house in The Simpsons has suffered similar treatment, but Family Guy's version of this particular continuity flexibility is sometimes pushed further than the genre convention typically allows. Episodes have depicted damage to the property that would, in any realistic assessment, require complete demolition and reconstruction, and the next episode's establishing shot shows the house standing precisely as it always has. The timeline of Peter's employment history is another source of significant continuity challenges. Peter has worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a fishery, and various other employers over the course of the show's history. The transitions between these jobs have not always been clearly established, and there are episodes where his employment situation appears to be one thing, while earlier episodes established it as something different. The brewery has become the most consistent workplace across the show's run, but even there, specific details about his position, his colleagues, and his working conditions have shifted enough to constitute contradictions. The question of where the Drunken Clam is relative to the Griffin home, and what route Peter takes to get there, has been analyzed with some seriousness by fans who have tried to map the neighborhood. The walk between the two locations appears to be different lengths in different episodes, with the bar sometimes seeming to be around the corner and sometimes seeming to be significantly further away. This is partly a function of the show's flexible spatial sense. Animation doesn't have to be consistent about distances between locations in the way that live-action production does, because the world only needs to look right in individual shots rather than in aggregate, but it creates a neighborhood that doesn't quite cohere when you try to think about it as a real place. Section 10 Expanded Production Secrets continued. The relationship between Family Guy and its sister show, American Dad, offers one of the more interesting production history comparisons in American animation. The two shows were developed in the same period, premiered within months of each other, share many production team members, and exist in a connected fictional universe. Yet they have had dramatically different critical and cultural trajectories, with American Dad quietly accumulating a reputation for consistent quality, while Family Guy's reputation has been more turbulent. Some of the production differences between the two shows are structural and have clear effects on the creative output. American Dad does not use cutaway gags, which means that every joke has to emerge from character and situation rather than from an interruption of the narrative. This constraint forces the writing to be more disciplined and produces episodes that have a more coherent story structure, but it also means that the show cannot rely on the kind of disconnected, can-be-funny-in-isolation gag that became Family Guy's calling card and, in later seasons, its crutch. The writing room culture for the two shows, while overlapping in personnel, has developed differently. American Dad's room has been described by people who have worked in both as more focused on story structure and character consistency, while Family Guy's room has traditionally been more focused on individual joke quality and cultural relevance. Neither approach is inherently better. The best Family Guy episodes demonstrate that the show can achieve extraordinary things when it combines great individual jokes with coherent storytelling. And the best American Dad episodes demonstrate that storytelling discipline can produce comedy that is both very funny and emotionally resonant. The overseas animation studios that produce Family Guy have changed across the show's history, and the changes are visible in the finished product for viewers who pay close attention to animation quality. The current primary animation studio for Family Guy is Titmouse Inc., which is based in the United States rather than overseas. This is a relatively recent development in the show's production history and reflects a broader shift in how some American animated shows are managing their production pipelines. The animation in recent seasons has a slightly different quality from earlier seasons' overseas work, with different strengths and different areas of inconsistency. The scoring of specific episodes has become, in the later seasons, more ambitious than in the early years. Walter Murphy's work on the show has included some genuinely sophisticated musical choices. Moments where the orchestration comments on what is happening on screen, with a nuance that the dialogue doesn't always provide, where a shift in musical register communicates something about a character's emotional state that the animation isn't depicting directly. These moments are easy to miss because the music operates in the background, but they represent a level of craft in the show's production that is often overlooked in assessments of what the show is doing well or badly. The voice direction for the show, the work of guiding the actors through their performances in the recording booth, is handled by someone on the production team, whose work is largely invisible to the audience but critical to what they experience. A line of dialogue that is written one way can be performed in multiple ways, each of which produces a different comedy result, and the choice between those interpretations is made partly by the actor and partly by whoever is directing the session. The specific ways that MacFarlane performs his characters across hundreds of episodes reflect accumulated decisions about exactly how each character sounds in any given situation, decisions that are made in real time in the recording booth, and that shape the finished episode in ways that the script alone cannot. Section 11 expanded the Meg conspiracy. Continued, the academic study of Family Guy's treatment of Meg Griffin has produced some genuinely interesting work in the field of media studies. The character has become a reference point in discussions of how animated comedy handles female characters, how comedy can normalize contempt for specific social positions, and how sustained comedic aggression against a single target changes from humor into something that operates more like social messaging. The specific mechanisms by which Meg's mistreatment was normalized across the show's run offer a case study in how comedy can shift an audience's relationship to cruelty without the audience fully registering the shift. Each individual joke about Meg, taken in isolation, could be defended as absurdist hyperbole, the kind of extreme exaggeration that animated comedy has always relied on. But the accumulation of those jokes across many seasons, all aimed at the same target, all reinforcing the same messages about the character's worth and desirability and right to basic dignity, produced a cumulative effect that went beyond any individual joke. The show's own characters occasionally acknowledged the nature of what was happening. Brian's speech to Meg at the end of the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, in which he explains that Meg's role in the family is to be the one everyone else projects their frustrations onto, is a surprisingly clear-eyed description of the show's own use of the character. Brian is essentially explaining to Meg why the show needs her to keep accepting her treatment, because without her in that position, the show's other characters lose their most reliable outlet for the kind of behavior that the show wanted to present as comedy. The contrast between how Meg is written in her strongest episodes versus how she is written in her weakest is particularly instructive. In episodes like the Season 8 episode, to which various critics have pointed as a genuine attempt to write Meg as a full character, where she is given a storyline that requires her to be competent and determined, and eventually triumphant. The character is immediately more interesting, and the humor around her has a completely different quality. Comedy built on Meg's resilience and capability is both funnier and more humane than comedy built on her humiliation, and the show knows this because it demonstrates it in those individual episodes. The decision to gradually reduce Meg's mistreatment in later seasons has been credited, as mentioned earlier, to the addition of women to the writing staff. But it is also worth noting that the cultural conversation around how women are depicted in comedy had shifted significantly between 2000 and 2015, and the show was operating in a different environment in the later seasons than the one that produced the worst of the Meg material. Whether the change came primarily from within the writer's room or from a broader shift in what the culture was willing to accept from comedy is probably impossible to determine precisely, but the combination of internal and external pressure toward treating Meg more humanely reflects a moment when those two things were aligned in an unusual way. Section 12 expanded unsolved mysteries. Continued. The mystery of the show's fictional geography, the exact layout of the town in which the Griffins live, its relationship to the actual geography of Rhode Island, its internal logic as a place is one that fans have spent considerable energy on without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. The town is clearly a fictionalized version of a Rhode Island coastal community, drawing on real elements of the geography and culture of the state where MacFarlane went to college. But the specific details of the town's layout, its economy, its relationship to other Rhode Island cities have never been fully established. This geographical vagueness is partly a deliberate choice, a specific enough setting to give the show a distinctive character, but vague enough to accommodate any plot the writers want to tell, and partly simply a result of the show not caring particularly about internal geographical consistency. But it creates a mystery in the sense that the place where the Griffins live is simultaneously very specific feeling and genuinely impossible to locate. You know you're in New England. You know you're in Rhode Island. You know the community is a coastal suburb of a city. Beyond that, the geography gets flexible in exactly the ways that serve the needs of any given episode. The question of what Stewie's future holds, what the character would be if the show allowed him to grow up, is one of the most compelling thought experiments that the show has generated and never resolved. Several episodes have depicted future versions of Stewie, but these are always from altered timelines or imagined futures rather than from a genuine linear continuation of the character's development. What would Stewie be at 5? At 10? At 20? Would the evil genius remain, transformed into something more socially functional? Would the emotional vulnerability that defines the later Stewie become the dominant trait? Would the fake British accent eventually be replaced by something more genuine? The show has never committed to answering these questions, because doing so would require allowing its youngest character to actually change in ways that couldn't be undone. The floating timeline that keeps the Griffin children more or less the same age year after year is not just a production convenience, it is a form of narrative cowardice, a refusal to accept the consequences of time passing for characters whose youth and immaturity are part of what makes them funny. The price of that refusal is that certain kinds of stories, the ones that require growth and genuine change, become impossible to tell. The mystery of Peter Griffin's exact intelligence is worth sitting with as a closing thought. Early Peter, as the show's own voice transcript noted, was dumb in a specific and grounded way. He made bad decisions because he didn't think things through, not because he lacked basic cognitive function. He was capable of genuine insight in moments of emotional clarity. He could learn, within an episode, and apply what he had learned within that episode, even if the lesson didn't stick past the end credits. Later, Peter operates according to a different logic entirely. His intellectual failures are more extreme, less consistent, and less humanely rendered. He is stupid in ways that make him functionally incompatible with normal social life. And yet he maintains his job, his marriage, and his friendships, which requires a kind of selective incompetence that the show applies according to what any given episode needs rather than according to any coherent internal logic. The gap between early Peter and later Peter is not just a character change. It is a philosophical shift in how the show understands its lead character. Early Peter is a man who could be better, and occasionally is. Later Peter is a force of nature who exists to generate comedic disaster, and the question of whether he could be better is never quite asked because the show has stopped caring about the answer. What we lost, between those two versions of the character, is the sense that these characters exist within a world where their choices matter and their failures mean something. And that, perhaps more than any specific joke or specific character change, is the deepest mystery of what happened to Family Guy over the years. The golden era of the show, those first 3 seasons, those original episodes that people return to with such persistent affection, was built on the belief that the characters mattered, that their failures were funny because they were real failures, felt by real people in real families, that the humor emerged from something true about human experience rather than from the mechanical generation of comedic shocks. Whether that belief can be recovered, whether a show that has been running for as long as Family Guy can find its way back to caring about its characters the way the original writers clearly cared about them, that is the question that remains open, and the most compelling mystery that the show's history leaves behind. Thank you for sitting with all of this, for spending these hours with the hidden history of a show that has been part of so many people's lives for so many years. The mysteries are real, the stories are real, and the people who made this show, for all the frustrations and disappointments and creative wrong turns that accumulated across decades, were people who cared about making something that mattered. That intention, even when it failed, is worth remembering. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next one. Section 13. The Giant Chicken Enigma. The mystery nobody bothered to solve. There are exactly 2 ongoing conflicts in Family Guy that have no origin story the show considers worthy of full examination. One is the relationship between Brian and Quagmire, which the show eventually addressed directly through Quagmire's famous speech. The other is the feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken, which the show has revisited across many seasons, in increasingly elaborate and structurally complex battle sequences without ever providing a satisfying explanation for why any of it started in the first place. The inciting incident, as established in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, involves a coupon. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that was expired, and Peter was furious about it. That is the foundational event. A man was given an expired coupon by a giant chicken, and the resulting conflict has destroyed buildings, killed bystanders, derailed trains, crashed aircraft, and caused property damage that, in aggregate, across all the episodes that contain giant chicken fight sequences, would run into the billions of dollars. The proportionality between the original insult and the ongoing response is so extreme that the show has occasionally acknowledged the absurdity, but it has never resolved the underlying question of what Ernie the Giant Chicken actually is. Is Ernie a person? He appears to be. In a sense, he has a wife who appears in at least one episode, a domestic life that the show briefly depicts in cutaway shots, a job or at least a social position that requires him to interact with other people. He gives out coupons, which suggests some kind of commercial activity. He survives what should be lethal injuries and then reappears in subsequent episodes in full health, which puts him in the same category as Peter himself, a character for whom the show's physical consequences are temporarily applied and then erased. The fight sequences between Peter and Ernie are, from a pure craft standpoint, some of the most technically accomplished content Family Guy has ever produced. They are extended, elaborately choreographed action sequences that draw on action cinema conventions. The staging of the fights borrows from Hong Kong action films, from Hollywood action blockbusters, from martial arts movies, and they are executed with a degree of animation quality that the show does not always apply to its regular content. When the giant chicken appears, the production clearly commits extra resources to making the fight look extraordinary, which means the fights are simultaneously the show's most absurd content and some of its most technically impressive. The giant chicken's perspective, what the conflict looks like from his side, is something the show has almost never explored. We have seen, in brief glimpses, that Ernie appears to return to a normal life between fights. We have seen his wife's face when he comes home battered. We have seen, briefly, what appears to be genuine emotion from Ernie after fights that have left both combatants near death. But the show has never spent significant time inside Ernie's experience of the conflict, because doing so would require the show to take him seriously as a character rather than as a recurring comedic mechanism. The one episode where the show came closest to humanizing Ernie was The Sequence, spread across multiple seasons, where Peter and Ernie appear to have genuinely resolved their conflict. In these brief moments, which never last past the episode that contains them, there is something that looks like genuine mutual regard between the two men. They have fought so many times, survived so many things together, that the relationship has taken on the quality of a bond, however adversarial. The fact that the conflict always resumes, that the armistices never hold, is itself a comment on something the show has never quite articulated: the way that certain kinds of conflict become their own purpose, independent of whatever originally started them. The giant chicken fights have been studied by fans of animation for their technical qualities with as much seriousness as film students would bring to analyzing an action sequence by John Woo or Jackie Chan. The choreography, the timing, the use of environmental elements as weapons or obstacles, the escalating scale of destruction, these are not random. They are designed with a specific visual intelligence, and the decisions that went into designing them reflect a genuine understanding of action cinema grammar. Whatever you think of the giant chicken as a narrative element, as an animation exercise, the fights represent some of the most skilled work the show has ever done. What the giant chicken enigma ultimately represents is the show's willingness to commit to something genuinely strange and then never explain it. Most of Family Guy's strange elements get explained eventually, or at least addressed. Stewie's evil genius gets historicized, Brian's sophistication gets deconstructed, Quagmire's behavior gets called out. But Ernie the Giant Chicken just keeps fighting. The absurdity is maintained in its purest form, never allowed to become familiar through explanation, never domesticated into something comfortable. There is a chicken. He is enormous. He and Peter Griffin fight with extreme and recurring violence for reasons that began with a coupon and have long since transcended their origin. That is all the show has ever been willing to say about it. And in a show that explains too many of its jokes, the giant chicken's unexplained mystery is something close to a gift. Section 14. The Rhode Island Connection. What the show actually knows about its own setting. The decision to set Family Guy in Rhode Island is one of the more interesting geographic choices in American animated comedy history. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the country, with a total area of just over 1,214 square miles, smaller than many individual counties in larger states. Its population is just over 1 million people, which makes it, by population, the 7th least populated state in the country. It is, in other words, an extremely specific and distinctive place, with a culture and a history and a character that are genuinely unique among American states. Seth MacFarlane's connection to Rhode Island is real and personal. He spent 4 years at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, which is the state's capital and its largest city. Providence has a specific quality, a post-industrial New England city with a significant university presence, a complicated relationship to its history as both an important colonial port and a city that has experienced significant economic decline since the mid-20th century, and a culture that is neither quite Boston nor quite New York but something distinctly its own. MacFarlane's time there was formative, and the show's setting reflects genuine familiarity with what it feels like to live in that particular part of the country. The show's use of Rhode Island details is inconsistent in interesting ways. Some elements of the state's real geography and culture appear accurately. The general coastal suburban character of the town, references to real Rhode Island institutions, and cultural touchstones, the particular kind of working-class New England Catholic household that the Griffin family represents. But other details are clearly invented or borrowed from generic American suburban settings that have nothing specifically to do with Rhode Island. The question of where exactly in Rhode Island the Griffins live is one that the show has deliberately kept vague. The town is described as being in Rhode Island and existing near the coast, but its specific relationship to Providence, to Newport, to the other significant settlements in the state has never been established. This vagueness is probably correct from a production standpoint. Too much specificity would constrain the kinds of stories the show could tell, but it means that the Rhode Island setting is more of a flavor than a fact. It gives the show a particular regional character without binding it to any specific place. What Rhode Island means to the show thematically is more interesting than what it provides geographically. Rhode Island is a state with a significant Catholic population, a strong working-class identity, and a history of being the smallest and often the most overlooked member of the New England region. Setting the show, there is a way of locating the Griffin family specifically. These are not generic Americans, but a particular kind of New Englander, shaped by a specific religious and class background, living in a place that is always slightly in the shadow of the larger, louder cities to its north and south. Peter Griffin's Catholicism, which is a persistent background element of the show across many seasons, is inseparable from this regional setting. He is a Catholic because he is a working-class Rhode Island Irish-Italian man, because that is what people of his specific background in that specific place tend to be. The show's jokes about Peter's faith and his relationship to the church work partly because they are grounded in a real and specific religious culture rather than in a generic version of American Christianity. Section 15. The music of Family Guy, what the score has been doing all along. There is a dimension of Family Guy that almost never appears in discussions of the show's quality, its history, or its mysteries, and that dimension is its music. Family Guy is, in ways that most viewers don't fully register, a musically sophisticated production. The combination of original scoring, licensed music, and original musical comedy numbers that the show uses across its episodes represents a significant creative investment and produces effects that operate below most viewers' conscious awareness. Walter Murphy, who has served as the show's primary composer for much of its history, brings a background in jazz and orchestral composition to a format that is more often associated with simple, functional television scoring. Murphy's orchestrations for Family Guy are more complex than the show's comedic content strictly requires, and that complexity is part of what gives certain scenes an emotional texture that the animation and dialogue alone couldn't produce. The most discussed musical element of Family Guy is the original musical comedy number. From the earliest seasons, the show has occasionally broken into what amounts to a full theatrical musical production, characters singing, elaborate choreography in the animation, production values that exceed anything else in the episode. These numbers range from gentle parodies of Broadway conventions to genuinely moving original songs, and the show's facility with the musical comedy form is one of its most underappreciated strengths. The song You Have AIDS, which was part of a Season 4 episode, is one of the most notorious examples of the show's musical numbers, and also one of the clearest illustrations of the gap between the show's tonal aspirations and its execution. The joke, a barbershop quartet informing a patient of his AIDS diagnosis through song, is extremely dark, and the musical performance itself is technically accomplished enough that the darkness is genuinely felt rather than simply stated. This combination of craft and darkness is the thing that makes Family Guy's best musical moments memorable. They work as actual musical comedy even as they work as shock humor. The Road to episodes, which feature Brian and Stewie on travel adventures, are notable for the quality of their original songs. These are episodes where MacFarlane's background as a classically trained singer and his genuine affection for mid-20th century American popular music comes through most clearly. The songs in these episodes are not parodies, they are original compositions in specific genre styles that the show's characters perform with something close to real feeling. Brian and Stewie singing together has a specific quality that no other combination of characters on the show can replicate, because the combination of MacFarlane's musical knowledge and the specific chemistry between the characters produces something genuinely moving. The show also uses licensed music in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes surprisingly subtle. The choice of which song to use in a specific emotional moment, the decision to cut to silence when the score has been building towards something, and then let the silence land. These are music editorial decisions that shape the experience of watching the show in ways that are felt before they are understood. The composer's specific orchestration choices for recurring elements of the show have created a musical identity that is instantly recognizable. The specific sonic signature of a Family Guy episode is part of what makes the show feel like itself, even across many years and many different creative configurations. This auditory consistency is a form of brand identity that operates completely independently of visual design or character consistency, and it represents one of the most durable creative achievements in the show's long history. Section 16. What Family Guy changed the show's actual legacy? Before we close this particular journey through the hidden history of a show that has been running longer than many of its viewers have been alive, it is worth spending some time with the question of what Family Guy actually changed. Not in terms of its internal history, not in terms of what happened to the characters across the seasons, but in terms of what the show did to the landscape of American television and American comedy that would not have happened without it. The cutaway gag, which was a feature of animated comedy before Family Guy, but was never the central organizing principle of a show the way it became with the Griffin family, was transformed by the show's success into an exportable format. Shows that came after Family Guy animated comedies that launched in the decade following the show's debut incorporated the cutaway structure as a baseline feature of what adult animated comedy could be, precisely because Family Guy's use of it had demonstrated that audiences would accept and embrace it. The format's influence extended beyond animation. The cutaway gag structure interrupts the main narrative with a disconnected joke. Return to the main narrative appears in live-action comedy that followed in the show's wake, adapted to different contexts but built on the same principle. The idea that a joke doesn't have to emerge from the story being told, that comedy can be inserted into a narrative rather than produced by it, was popularized by Family Guy in ways that subsequent creators built on. The show's relationship with the internet, and specifically with the early YouTube era, was genuinely formative for how television content circulates. Family Guy's individual cutaway gags were among the first television clips to be widely shared online, to go viral in the pre-social media sense of being passed from person to person through email and forum links. The show was designed, partly by accident and partly by intuition, in units of humor that were perfect for this kind of sharing, self-contained, short, funny in isolation from any narrative context. This relationship with internet distribution shaped how the show was subsequently made. Writers began thinking about which moments from episodes would be the ones that got shared, which jokes would generate the viral clips that brought in new viewers and maintained the show's cultural relevance between seasons. This feedback loop between the show's creative process and its online reception is one of the first examples of a phenomenon that has now become ubiquitous in entertainment production. The influence of anticipated digital circulation on the primary creative decisions made in production. The show's influence on the culture of adult animation in the first decade of the 21st century is difficult to overstate. American Dad was the direct product of the show's success. The Cleveland show extended the Family Guy universe into a separate series. Seth MacFarlane's cultural prominence, his hosting of the Academy Awards, his career as a singer, his production deal with NBC Universal all flow from the success of Family Guy in ways that are easy to trace. The show is, in a very direct sense, responsible for a significant portion of what Seth MacFarlane has been able to do in the entertainment industry. The show also changed what was possible for adult animated comedy to address directly, both in terms of content and in terms of cultural ambition. Family Guy's willingness to engage with political subjects, to make explicit comedy about religion and sexuality and race and all the other sensitive subjects that American broadcast television had traditionally avoided, opened space for other shows to operate in ways they might not have been able to without the precedent. Whether this is an unambiguous good is a question worth sitting with. The space that opened was also space that could be filled with material that was offensive without being meaningful, but the opening itself was real. The show's canceled and revived story also changed the television industry's understanding of what was possible in an era of DVD sales and online viewership. Family Guy was the first show to be brought back from cancellation specifically because of strong aftermarket performance, DVD sales and cable syndication ratings, rather than because of ratings during its original broadcast run. This proved to the industry that a show's audience could persist and grow through channels other than the one on which it originally aired, a lesson that has shaped how networks think about canceled shows and streaming rights in the decades since. The show's longevity, which at various points has seemed surprising to everyone, including its creator, reflects something about the specific kind of cultural staying power that certain animated comedies can achieve. The Griffin family, whatever their various transformations and whatever the show's creative failings across its long run, occupies a space in American popular culture that was not there before 1999 and will not disappear simply because the show eventually ends. The characters are real in the way that fictional characters can become real through the accumulated investment of millions of people over many years, through the conversations and arguments and genuine emotional responses that the show has generated, through the specific way that certain episodes, certain moments, certain lines of dialogue have worked their way into the language that people use to talk to each other. Peter Griffin is a real person in the way that Archie Bunker is a real person, in the way that Homer Simpson is a real person, not because they have bodies or biographies that exist anywhere outside of their shows, but because they have become part of how their culture understands certain kinds of people, certain kinds of situations, certain kinds of humor. That is a genuine achievement, and it is worth naming clearly in any honest accounting of what the show accomplished. The mysteries we have explored tonight, the lost pilot, the deleted scenes, the hidden background details, the questions about characters who changed and characters who stayed the same, and characters who were never fully explained, are all expressions of the same basic fact. Family Guy mattered enough that people spent years paying close attention to it. They noticed things. They asked questions. They built elaborate theories about the implications of specific details that the show probably never intended to be examined so closely. That level of attention is reserved for things that have genuinely gotten inside people, that have settled into the furniture of their inner lives and become part of the material they think with. Whether the show earned that attention completely, whether it deserved everything that its most devoted fans gave it, is a separate question. But the attention itself is real, and it is a form of love, and it says something about the show that generated it that is worth sitting with on a quiet night when the rest of the world has gone to sleep. Rest well. Stay curious. These are stories worth knowing. End of full script 3 hours of unknown Family Guy mysteries to fall asleep. A final note, the show that refuses to end. There is something worth saying about the sheer persistence of Family Guy, about the fact that a show canceled twice in its first 3 years has now been renewed through its 27th season and will be producing new episodes into 2029, which marks its 30th year on air. No animated comedy in the history of American television has had a stranger or more improbable journey than this one. A 24-year-old man made a 16-minute film on $50,000, and 30 years later, the characters he created are still on television every week. The renewal in April 2025, which extended the show through season 27, was described as a major deal with parent company Disney, a reminder that the Fox and Disney corporate families are now intertwined in ways that would have seemed completely science fictional back when the show first aired. Seth MacFarlane, who has been publicly vocal about his discomfort with certain aspects of his relationship with Fox, now finds himself in a corporate arrangement that involves Disney, a company whose animated legacy is one of the defining influences on every animated show that followed it, including Family Guy. What the show's 30-year anniversary will look like is genuinely impossible to predict. The landscape of American television in 2029 will be so different from the one in which Family Guy premiered that the comparison between them will feel almost purely historical. Streaming platforms that didn't exist in 1999 will be where most of the show's audience encounters it. The cultural context in which the jokes land will have changed in ways that the writers in 2028 cannot fully anticipate any more than the writers in 1998 could have anticipated theirs. But some things will probably be the same. Peter will probably still be working at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. Stewie will still be in his high chair. Brian will still be writing a novel he can't finish. The Drunken Clam will still be there, on whatever route the show decides to put it. The Griffins will still be in their house on Spooner Street, with its persistent continuity errors and its carefully maintained background details and its improbable survival of catastrophes that would have destroyed any real building many times over. And somewhere in the background of those episodes, placed carefully by an artist who knows that most viewers will never see it, there will be something hidden, a word spelled out in the wrong orientation. A newspaper headline with a joke nobody asked for. A framed photograph that references something from 15 years ago. A detail that exists entirely for the one viewer in 1,000 who happens to be paying close enough attention. This is the thing that the show has always done. Across 30 years, across cancellations and revivals, and ratings collapses, and creative shifts and behind-the-scenes tension, and cultural controversies and everything else that has happened to Family Guy in its long and strange existence, someone has always been placing hidden things in the backgrounds, trusting that somewhere out there, someone is watching closely enough to find them. If you are that person, and if you have stayed with this for the last several hours, you probably are then you know something that the casual viewer does not. You know that the show rewards attention in ways that it never announces. You know that beneath the noise of the more extreme content, there are layers of craft and care that have been there from the beginning. You know that the people who made this show, whatever their failures, were people who cared about making something worth looking at carefully. That is what I wanted to leave you with tonight. The show is imperfect in ways we have explored extensively, but it is also, in its best moments, something made by people who were genuinely trying to create something extraordinary. And across 30 years, against all probability, they produce something that people still stay up late to think about. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Sleep well. The voice actors you never knew were there. One of the most fascinating and genuinely underappreciated dimensions of Family Guy's production history involves the performers who contributed to the show without ever being widely recognized for it. The show has used an enormous number of guest voices across its run over 400 episodes, each containing multiple characters, adds up to a staggering amount of voice work, and the names attached to some of that work would surprise even longtime fans. The show's connection to the sketch comedy world has produced some of its most interesting casting. Mike Henry, who voices Herbert and several other recurring characters, was part of the show's writing team before he was a performer, which means that the characters he voices were shaped partly by his own sensibility as a writer and partly by his instincts as a performer. This kind of dual involvement writing and performing the same character creates a specific kind of coherence that is visible in how consistently Herbert has been characterized across many seasons. The guest star history of Family Guy is a document of American entertainment culture from the late 1990s onward. The show has attracted performers from almost every corner of the entertainment industry: film actors, musicians, politicians, athletes, comedians, news anchors, and the diversity of that guest list reflects the show's ambition to be in conversation with all of popular culture simultaneously. Some of these appearances are well known and well documented. Others were brief and have been largely forgotten, preserved only in the credits of specific episodes that few people go back to watch. The musicians who have appeared on the show as themselves represent a particular category of guest appearance. Conway Twitty, whose performances became the show's most notorious use of licensed content, was deceased. By the time his footage was used, the show was licensing archive material rather than booking a live performance. This created a specific and unusual dynamic, where the performer being featured had no awareness of the context in which his performances were being used, and where the question of how he would have felt about the deployment of his work is genuinely unanswerable. Other musicians who appeared on the show as themselves, in animated cameo form, ranged from artists who were deeply connected to the show's cultural moment, performers who were at the peak of their cultural relevance when they appeared, to artists whose careers had peaked decades earlier and whose appearance on the show was a form of nostalgic revisiting. The show's relationship with pop culture history, its willingness to reference artists and cultural figures from across the entire 20th century, is one of the things that gives it a particular texture that connects it to a broader entertainment tradition than most animated comedies attempt. The character of James Woods, who plays a fictionalized version of the real actor James Woods across multiple episodes, is one of the show's most extended and elaborate celebrity parody constructions. The real James Woods has been involved in various ways with the show's depiction of his fictional counterpart, which creates a specific and fascinating situation where the line between the real person and the animated character becomes genuinely blurry. The fictional James Woods has his own story arcs, his own relationships with the Griffin family, his own internal logic, and yet he is recognizably built on specific traits and behaviors associated with the real actor. The show's relationship with celebrity culture is most interesting in the moments where it is most specific. Generic celebrity parody jokes about famous people in general produces different comedy than jokes built on specific, accurate observations about specific, real people. Family Guy at its best works in the specific register, producing humor that is funny because you recognize the truth in it, because the show has looked carefully at its subject and found something real to say about it. The celebrity parody episodes that land most effectively are the ones where the writers clearly did their homework on whoever they were parodying, where the jokes reflect genuine knowledge of the target rather than generic celebrity jokes with a specific name attached. The voice actors who have been with the show since the beginning and who continue to perform in it represent one of its most extraordinary achievements in terms of professional consistency. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the pitch pilot in 1997, has been associated with these characters for nearly 3 decades. Seth Green, who has voiced Chris since the broadcast pilot in 1999, has grown into an adult and established a film and television career of his own while continuing to return to the recording booth for Family Guy episodes. The continuity of these core performances across such an extended period is genuinely rare in any medium. What the voice cast brings to the show, beyond technical competence, is accumulated context. When Seth MacFarlane performs as Peter Griffin in 2025, he is not simply performing a character. He is inhabiting a role that he has inhabited for nearly 30 years, that he knows from the inside in ways that no new performer could replicate regardless of their talent. The history of the performance is present in every current performance, giving it a depth that emerges not from any single recording session, but from the cumulative experience of having been this person for almost as long as most of the audience has been alive. This accumulated context is part of what makes certain moments in the later seasons unexpectedly powerful. When Peter does something that connects to who he was in Season 1, when Brian has a moment that recalls the character's original warmth, when Stewie shows a flash of the evil genius that defined his early years, these moments work not just on their own terms but as echoes of a very long history. The audience that has been watching since the beginning brings that entire history to any given scene, and the performers who have been working that entire time bring their accumulated understanding of who these people are. That richness of accumulated history is, finally, the show's deepest mystery and its most durable achievement. After 30 years, across all the changes and failures and creative decisions that turned some viewers away and disappointed others, there is still something there that rewards returning to. Something in the characters, something in the world, something in the specific combination of performers and writers and animators who have given their work to this thing that makes it worth thinking about at length. In the dark, at the end of a long day, you have been thinking about it with me tonight. Thank you for that, for the curiosity and the patience and the willingness to stay with something complicated and imperfect because you believed it was worth understanding. It was. Now, rest.